Good afternoon, everyone. If you could have a seat, please. We're ready to begin. The agenda for today should be out. Copies of Senator Cogdell's bill are available online. Members here should have a copy. We're going to be hearing from Senator Cogdell on a proposed water bond between now and 2 o'clock, and then the senator will have to leave. Following him, unless we have another member that's presenting on a bond, we'll have proposed financing review language, not just of the bond, but financing general of operations. What needs to be funded, for example, how do we pay for the Stewardship Council, the Delta Conservancy, some of the water conservation programs or groundwater monitoring programs, etc. What kinds of lessons have we learned from CalFed relating to ongoing fee structures? That'll be part of our second panel, as well as overlapping into some discussion. Additionally, questions to Mr. Eisenberg and the LAO's office relating to the bond. And then hopefully around 2:45 or 3, for at least a half an hour, we're listening to public comments. Just so you know, as per the tradition established in the last hearing, we're going to hear on public comments first from one representative representing the 5 county supervisors for up to 5 minutes, followed by other people on public comment. Any other members wish to say anything at this time? If not, Senator Cogdell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to once again appear before you.
Is your mic on, sir?
Do
you have priority? Try that.
There we go.
I was cutting you off.
That's all right.
I'm sure it was unintentional.
Might as well be preemptive.
Do you mean I can press this button and cut him off?
Oh, you're going to want to hear all of this. This is good. Again, thank you both very much for convening this hearing and for allowing me the opportunity to be here and to once again talk about something that is obviously very important, I think, to all of us as Californians, and an issue as it relates to water in general and the bond and specifically that many of us have worked on now for a number of years. The language that's before you represents the most recent iteration, if you will, of that effort, but it is very similar in most cases, certainly from the standpoint of its structure, to what you have seen before. There isn't really a lot new from that standpoint, and I just basically want to make a quick overview, if you will, of it so I can leave plenty of time to answer your specific questions relating to this proposal. The chapters in this bond are, again, very similar to what you've seen before. Chapter 6 is for regional water supply, and the source of that chapter primarily came from the Feinstein-Schwarzenegger effort. Chapter 7 for the Delta, the source of that was Steinberg's bond that we all saw near the end of session. Chapter 8 for the overall statewide operational improvement, that was part of my original bond, and we have done everything we can now to try to make sure we keep the issues relating to surface water storage in Chapter 8 for the purposes of, again, not trying to confuse anyone. Chapter 9 is for conservation and watershed restoration. That was in all 3 of the previous bonds that you have seen. Chapter 10 for groundwater, that was originally in the Feinstein-Schwarzenegger effort. Chapter 11 for recycling, again, Feinstein-Schwarzenegger, but in this particular iteration, there's new funding for the 20% by 2020 conservation goals that we discussed in length on Monday as part of Senator Steinberg's policy bill. The overall size of this bond is now $9.4 billion, and it was reduced to try to address some of the concerns about overall size that we've all heard about. And also, I think an important point to make about this particular package, this bond, is the fact that we have, again, in trying to be as cognizant as we could of the financial realities facing this state, to structure the financing portion of the bond in such a way to, again, reflect those realities. On page 32 of this bond, we spell out how only half of the bond, $4.7 billion, can be sold before July 1st of 2015. So, again, we think that that's an appropriate way to proceed, to hopefully have the question put before the legislature and the people and structure it in such a way to, again, hopefully cause the least amount of impact on the general fund. I think it's important to note, too, that which I think gets confused sometimes in people's mind when they take into consideration the existing problems with our general fund and the issues of debt service and when that debt service will actually start to impact the general fund. This is not going to be a situation where the taxpayers are expected to pick up an additional $800 million, $1 billion, what have you, in debt service starting next year or the year following their approval, should they choose to do that at the poll, but rather will be structured in such a way that it will be phased in over time. We know it will take probably a decade, maybe a decade and a half under the best case scenarios to actually build a lot of this infrastructure. And as a result of that, and given the fact that the state on an ongoing basis, as we all heard from the LAO, I think in different meetings that we've attended, we do retire debt on an annual basis. There are requirements that the legislature enter into relating to how we structure our debt payments moving forward, what priorities, if you will, we choose to set. So again, we believe that there's enough flexibility the way we've structured this to take into consideration the impacts on the general fund of this new debt service and do it in a responsible way that doesn't increase the debt service to an unacceptable level. There are still a number of outstanding issues, if you will, that need to be addressed as it relates to this particular iteration, and I would stress again that it is a work in progress. Much like the policy bill that we heard on Monday, there are still areas of concern that need to be addressed, and negotiations need to be completed in those areas before we actually bring this bill forward for a vote. Those include things like the definition of the economically distressed areas and how those areas would be treated. There's concerns there relating to the fairness of that whole policy, so that's something that, again, is still under consideration. The amount of funding for the IRWM regional water supply, another area of concern that has been brought to the fore in the last 48 hours or so, and will continue to be looked at as we move forward. The methodology for distributing the integrated regional water management funding in the our original bond, and certainly in this iteration, we have followed existing IRWM language, and now we're understanding there's some concerns about whether or not that's the fairest way to move forward relating to this method of distributing the monies, and so that's another area that needs to be negotiated. The amount of the funding for the groundwater section, I know a lot of you have concerns about that and have rightfully so noticed that in this current iteration the amount of money available for groundwater has been substantially reduced, and there are a lot of concerns about that, and I will tell you that I happen to be one of the folks that also shares a lot of those concerns, and we'll continue to work on that particular section to see if we can't hopefully provide some more resources. Under the area of origin language issue, I think you're all, again, well aware that that's been a major bone of contention going back now over 3 years. And what we ultimately end up with there, our goal has always been to try to do everything we can to protect existing law as it relates to area of origin and to make sure that those protections aren't weakened. Obviously, there's some concerns from a number of folks, and I'm sure you'll hear testimony today relating to that. But again, I wanted to point out that although, or that the language that's in the current iteration of the bond, I guess, is, again, not set in stone. We continue to work in that area, and hopefully we'll be able to find an acceptable compromise there. The allocation of funding in the watershed restoration chapter, another area of contention and remaining concern that we will continue to work on. And again, just to reiterate that point at this time, that this is and continues to be a work in progress, and we will continue to work diligently to try to resolve as many of the outstanding issues as we can in the negotiating process, and again, bring forward what we believe to be the best possible product at the end of the day. So with that, I thank you again for the opportunity to make the presentation, and I'm more than willing to answer whatever questions I can.
All right, at this time, questions from members would be appropriate regarding specifics in the bond. You should have a copy in front of you. We have heard from this bond previously once or twice this year, but we didn't know which vehicle may or may not be used in the final decision by the legislature. So this will be just an informational hearing. So appropriate questions to Senator Cogdell would be very, very helpful at this time. Anything for the point of clarification? I have raised to Senator Cogdell the issue of groundwater, which he addressed in his opening comments. It was about $1 billion in some bonds that we've been more recently discussing, just because cleaning up groundwater is very, very important in many areas of the state. San Gabriel Valley, parts of the San Fernando Valley, water quality and water supply, instead of moving it long distances, make a lot of sense, and it's cost effective. So that's something I've asked Senator Cogdell to relook at when this begins to be negotiated. Senator Huff, I believe your hand was up.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You mentioned part of what my issue is, and that is groundwater cleanup. It's a huge issue in my area. And it appears that there's different pots of money in here that can be applied for in your bond. Can you speak to that as far as, we got the #1 Superfund cleanup site in the nation in the upper San Gabriel Valley underground aquifer. It's a 30-square-mile area, but we got about half the money for cleaning that up, and obviously half the money is not there for cleaning it up. And as we do a better job, as hopefully will in the future, of using groundwater for storage and recharge and use, clearly that has to be cleaned up. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how we're not doing carve-outs, but there are some pots of money available if they meet all the qualifications. Do you know what that would fall in?
Yeah, Aaron just reminded me, I think it's in just about every chapter where we do have pots of money to deal with that. And, when we went through, going back again 3 years, and I would point out, as again you're all well aware, this bond has always fluctuated somewhere between $10 and $12 billion, and most iterations have been right around the $10 billion mark. But the goals were several. One, certainly to assess the need. What is it going to take to, again, solve the problems comprehensively? That has been the goal of this effort, to make sure that we have a comprehensive approach to a clean and reliable water supply moving forward. And then second, to use a lot of existing information and formulas, if you will, relating to how money should be allocated in a fair way, and a lot of that's based on precedent and what's been done historically. There has been some effort to look a little bit deeper in some areas, given certain specifics, to see if it makes more sense to tweak those numbers, if you will, or those formulas based on what has evolved since the formulas were originally established. But that's been the overall goal as it relates to how the monies have been allocated at this point. And again, I would certainly reiterate our long-standing opinion, and shared by the chair, that groundwater is extremely important, that we do have some huge opportunities as it relates to storage capacity if we can just clean these aquifers up. Our goal has always been, to state it one more time, to find a better way to manage wet years when we do have heavy flows. And I can't think of a better way, in addition to surface water storage, to be able to get more of that water into clean groundwater basins. So it's important that we provide the resources necessary and hopefully put ourselves in a position to compete better for federal funding and whatever else may be available out there to clean up some of these Superfund sites.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Followed by Senator Wilk, then Senator Benoit. Mr. Cogdell will be leaving about 2 o'clock, so I am taking names of people who want to ask specific questions to him. So Senator Wilk, financing in general will probably be the next panel.
Yeah, that's fine. I want to ask about the bond. Dave, I have a matrix in front of me with all of the bonds that have been introduced over the past, for this session. Many of them predate this session as well. There are changes among the bonds, including your own, in terms of the amounts of money and the categories. So I don't have all of those yet, but I have a couple that I want to address, and maybe you can give me some ideas to what precipitated the change. One of the things that you had money in your bond, your original 371, was for invasive species. Has that been incorporated into another category? Or, yes?
It has
I
been.
see staff saying yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Major change with respect to the Delta counties and the monies going for levees, water quality, agriculture, fish and wildlife, down from what was $1 billion in your original, no, $700 million, now down to $500 million, what was, I believe, $1 billion in the Steinberg, in whatever bonds have been discussed. What's going on there? Did it get switched? Did it get reduced? Or?
Well, I know there has been some reallocation, and as you mentioned, Senator Steinberg at one point brought about $1 billion into the discussion about to deal with mitigation issues in the five-county region of the Delta. So I think a lot of that has been, has impacted some of the numbers in what were previous categories of the bond.
Okay, that has to do with economic mitigation issues for me. What you mentioned something in your talk.
That's the $1 billion that was outlined in some.
But you talked about in your opening statement about that still is being worked on in terms of economic mitigation.
Yeah, I don't know that we've completely identified everything that would be eligible under that category. There was a lot of concern about land that would be taken at some point, possibly off of the tax rolls, and the impact that that would have on the respective counties, and to be able to deal with that. That's a portion of what those funds I know would be available for. But I think there's still work to be done as it relates to what exactly will qualify to compete for that money.
Okay, because that also deals with levies as well. So in the bond, the language that controls the money. One of the things that I found interesting was that, for example, on the QSA, San Diego committed to long-term funding to address economic mitigation of the impacts of, for the Imperial Irrigation District in order to reduce those impacts. And I don't see a similar kind of language yet, again, that would require the beneficiaries to fund those impacts. So is it this $500 million?
I think, and I may be wrong in this, but I believe that there are categories of mitigation that I would, refer to as general versus specific, if you will, relating to a project or what have you. It's my understanding that as it's project related directly, that kind of mitigation would have to be borne by the beneficiaries, and I think they're more than willing to do that. They understand that. I think what we've talked about and what is covered here is more of a general, if you will, application to provide for mitigation that would not necessarily be appropriate to be charged strictly to the beneficiaries, but is more appropriate to be spread across a wider base, and in this case, the state of California.
Could you also then, thank you, could you also, I have two other questions. The economic development monies that are set aside for Siskiyou County, want to explain what impact does that
Yeah, again, I
address?
think we're all aware of the settlement that was reached, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, relating to the removal of the dams on the Klamath and the associated economic impact of the removal of those facilities to Siskiyou County is what we're trying to address there. and I'm trying to remember at this point, but it seems to me that a lot of that money was needed in order to move forward with the agreement that had been reached and actually facilitate the removal. $250 million. Okay, so the $250 million is there to mitigate for the removal of the dams. The other money is, again, basically just to realize and appreciate the economic impacts of those communities in Siskiyou County.
Question about the fact that this is a GEO bond, so that the general fund will be responsible for the interest payments. The treasurer has indicated that that ought to be a concern for us. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, and I think it is. Again, when you look back over the history of GEO bonds, and I think this committee is well aware of the existing debt service and what is out there, what's in the queue, if you will. I think it's important that we are sensitive to that. That's why we have made provision in this current iteration of the bond, again, to make sure that no more than half of it is issued before 2015. In other words, at least 5 years from now, we wouldn't have issued more than $4.7 billion, with the remainder of the bond coming after that date. We believe doing that structures it in such a way and allows us to design, if you will, the debt service in such a way to minimize the impact on the general fund. That's one mechanism. In addition to that, as I've stated, I believe the legislature has some opportunity, depending on what happens to be the general fund situation at the time, to weigh in as it relates to prioritization of future bond sales. I'm one that believes that there are few things more important to this state than a reliable, clean water supply as we move into the future, and certainly to provide the resources needed to do the many projects to aid in the restoration of the Delta. So I believe that future legislatures, hopefully in their wisdom, will be able to work with the structure that we've set out in this bond and do it in a responsible way that does not cause certainly quite the impact of the general fund that I think has been discussed both in the newspaper and in other venues that, again, in my opinion, reflect taking the total $9.4 billion, if you will, determining the annual debt service on that, and assuming that's going to be the hit to the general fund next year, when we know the general fund next year probably won't be in much better shape than it is today, could even be worse. But 5 years down the road, I think we all hope that things will be different. And again, we think we have structured this document in such a way as to provide for that flexibility.
Thank you, Dave. And Madam Chair, can I just ask you a question as to process?
Yes.
Senator Cogdill says that this is a work in progress, that there are still areas. Do you foresee and perhaps Senator Kehoe, oh, she's gone. Do you foresee an appropriations hearing on this in the future?
That would be something I will bring up to Senate Pro Tem Steinberg, whether that would be an appropriate vehicle, whether it should go to Policy Committee, whether it should go to Appropriations, whether there should be another, at least, informational hearing on those kinds of questions and concerns. I'll share them with him.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Benoit.
Thank you. Senator Cogdill, I certainly agree with your concern that this is probably at the top of the list of priority issues that California should be concerned about, and that if we're going to spend money, clean water is critical to our future. But I also have heard concerns about the fact that we've allocated funds in the past, particularly for storage, above ground storage particularly, that in the end it hasn't happened. Can you describe the process that would reassure myself and the people who ask me that question that this will result in some significant improvement in the area of storage?
Right. Chapter 8, again, is the cornerstone of the work, certainly from my standpoint, the efforts that we've put forward. And I think it's important to point out that the $3 billion that's talked about in that section of the bond is for what's commonly referred to as public benefit dollars. And that money can only be accessed, and I think this, again, is an important side, if you will, to the whole issue of financing. that $3 billion can only be accessed if the beneficiaries step forward and sign on the dotted line to issue revenue bonds in addition to this $3 billion in order to complete the projects. The three surface storage projects that we have commonly referred to, Sites Reservoir, Temperance Flat, and the expansion of Los Vaqueros, current cost estimates place at about $8 billion total construction costs. So another way to state this is that it's a way to leverage $8 billion worth of infrastructure with a $3 billion public benefit portion. And again, to iterate the fact that none of those dollars will be spent until we have the assurance that the beneficiaries are going to pick up the overwhelming bulk of the cost of the facility. In addition to that, as it relates to the although the projects I mentioned aren't named specifically in the bond, the criteria that is spelled out in Chapter 8 reflecting the projects that would be eligible for the money and be placed in the best position to compete, if you will. The number one requirement is that they contribute to the restoration of the Delta. We think that's obviously very important. Also, that only 50% of the overall construction costs for any one project can be accessed or can be provided through these general or public benefit rather monies. So that's another important aspect of how that particular section works. So when you talk about whether or not it'll ultimately result in surface water storage, I believe it's written in such a way that it will do that. The only caveat to that would be if the surface water storage projects can't meet the criteria that's in the bill, which includes an acceptable feasibility study. It has to be determined to be feasible by the Construction Commission before you could move forward, and a number of other safeguards. And if that's the case and surface storage can't meet those qualifications, then that $3 billion is available for additional groundwater work or other improvements that would, again, add to the water supply reliability.
Thank you, Senator Benoit. Assemblymember Yamada.
Thank you, Chair Pavley, and thank you, Senator Cogdill. I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the stipulations in the bill about funding for the various conservancies that already exist in the state. I think pages 17 and 18 of at least the draft, I haven't matched it to the actual printed bill, speaks to $200 million for the State Coastal Conservancy, $20 million for San Diego River Conservancy, $20 million for Santa Ana River Parkway, $100 million for the Wildlife Conservation Board, $10 million for Baldwin Hills, and $15 million for Santa Monica Conservancy, $75 million for Sierra Nevada, and so forth. I just wondered, was there some formula that was used to stipulate to these particular amounts? And then second part of my question speaks to, of course, the Delta Conservancy that I know Senator Wolk and I have very major interest in. And on page 12 of the draft bill talks about $1.5 billion allocated sort of to an overall Delta sustainability projects and so forth. I just wanted to know how you would see the two allocations, the existing conservancy funding and then the new and proposed Delta Conservancy funding. How would you see those balancing out? And was there a formula? I'm just wondering how these dollar amounts were assigned.
Well, to answer your first question, no, there wasn't any formula applied as it relates to the determination of these particular dollar amounts. And as you point out, a number of these conservancies do exist. They do have issues relating to water that need to be addressed, and they've all certainly made their case to us as we've worked on this over the years. So again, there isn't any formula to it, but it's been an attempt that we've made, obviously, to recognize the needs that are there and to do it in what we believe to be an appropriate manner. As it relates to the new conservancy and the $1.5 billion, obviously that's all new, and it's a situation that we know will require a considerable amount of money to deal with a situation that has evolved to the point that it's in today, which is not good by anyone's stretch of the imagination. So again, I think just to reiterate, there isn't any magic formula that's been applied here. It's just a matter of discussing with DWR and a number of other experts the problems and what may be needed in the way of resources to appropriately address them, and that's how we ultimately came up with the number.
So if I may just take that just another step further then. So again, any of these dollar amounts particularly stipulated to in terms of the Conservancy support is just sort of numbers that maybe staff recommended or that each Conservancy said, hey, this is how much we would want to have us support this bill, or, I'm just trying to get an idea
Probably
in my head.
over past bonds.
Over past bonds. And I apologize,
ability to use
I'm the
money.
newbie here, so I have to ask for historical purposes how
Well,
these amounts were arrived
Right,
at.
and I think we're all, to one extent or another, in that same boat, and we do have to rely on staff, and we have to rely, again, on the experts to tell us what's been done in the past and what has been found equitable and acceptable, and those guidelines, if you will, were certainly applied here, and that's how the numbers were arrived at. But again, to reiterate an earlier point, it is a work in progress, and I would expect at the end of the day, not only will the overall number be somewhat different, but probably allocations will be somewhat different.
I guess, and I'll just close with this, that since Senator Wolk and I, again, have this abiding interest in whatever the new Conservancy may be, that in fairness, there ought to be, I think, some way to justify allocations of funding, especially within this $1.5 billion, how much would be directed toward specific Conservancy efforts and other efforts that will also need to go towards sustaining the Delta.
I made a note of that on
Thank
how
you.
to do it on proposed conservancies.
Thank you.
Duly noted.
Thank you.
Other questions by members? I had one if no one wants to jump in. I was a little concerned, Senator Cogdell, or maybe it's confused or needed some clarification on your mountain counties overlay. That is something, looking at past bonds for traditional ways monies have been expended, that was not included in what sort of has happened. To clarify it, for example, Prop 84, about close to 14% of the money went to the San Francisco Bay Area. In your bond, it's about 8%. This would be integrated regional watershed monies, I would assume. The LA region had about 21% under Prop 84. It'll get about 10% in your bond. Santa Ana, 11%, 8% in your bond. San Diego, in Prop 84, got enough 9%. In your bond, it's close to 7%. But the big difference was the mountain counties overlay, so maybe you can clarify that. This is the first time money would fall into that category, and it's 5.7% of the total number.
Yeah, and I would just point out that, again, this is the most recent iteration. This has been, close to a month, I guess, since we closed down session. The last time we were very, very close. I think many of us thought to actually putting bills on the floor and being able to move this whole thing forward before. That did not turn out to be the reality. And between that point in time and now, there have been a number of concerns that have been raised, certainly in my office and I think in many of our offices relating to needs out there that maybe either weren't that well defined when we were writing the prior language on bonds, or have developed recently, or just for whatever reason hadn't come to the forefront before. And this is one of those areas where we're realizing that we've got major infrastructure problems relating to the delivery of, again, clean, reliable water in the foothill regions of this state. Many of these systems are still operating with open wooden flumes that were built by the miners in 1849. And you can imagine, as we have evolved, again, from the standpoint of clean water and all of the other regulations that we now have in place that have come about over the last century and a half, their infrastructure is in need of some major improvement. And again, many of those communities are suffering as a result of this economic downturn to even a greater extent than many of our urban areas. So it's very difficult for them to find the resources to make the improvements necessary to that infrastructure. And this is basically the case that they made to us, and the reason that in this iteration we have inserted the dollars that you speak of. The percentages, there wasn't any effort to try to in any way correlate those, I guess, with Prop 84 or any other previous bond issue relating to that specifically.
And that overlaps somewhat with your economic distress areas as well,
Somewhat, yeah.
to some extent. I had, you had some questions too. I had one last question for clarification. I know you appreciate the debt financing relating to the bonds, and that's why you have it in the two-tier program. But what I was a little bit confused about is, didn't know if you prioritized what part of the bond first and what would go out second, and how does that work with a $3 billion storage that's continuously appropriated?
The way the language states is stated in Chapter 8 relating to the whole process of moving projects forward and when feasibility work has to be done and accepted and all those kind of things. There's and certainly from the standpoint of the beneficiaries stepping forward and agreeing to come forward with their substantial portion of the construction cost, none of that, we don't believe, can take place before 2012. And that in reality, as it relates to the Chapter 8 portions of the bond, none of that money will be positioned in such a way to be spent before 2015. So when you ask what portions of the dollars will be spent first, I think it's safe to say virtually everything except Chapter 8 and an additional $1.7 billion in some of the other areas of the bond, again, depending upon what comes together and how it comes together and how the requirements are met as it relates to matches and other things required from water agencies to access some of the other monies in the bond. But I think everybody is certainly of a mind that we're not going to get to the point where we can actually start issuing any of the money out of the $3 billion pot until past 2015.
May need some clarification just for the purpose of those distributing the monies. Assemblymember Huffman.
Senator Cogdill, I have a few questions for you, but before I get there, I actually want to compliment you on how you've approached this issue. You've been working very, very long and hard on it. You've been focused like a laser beam. And what I especially respect and appreciate about the way you've approached this is it's not just going to rallies and press conferences. You've sat down thoughtfully with lots of different types of stakeholders. We had a 60-day legislative process, and you suffered through long meetings with us. You sat there not only when we were talking about storage, which is your favorite issue, but you sat there when we were down in the weeds on levee policy and fisheries issues and water quality and land use. So I just really want to commend you on the relentless but also thoughtful way that you have approached these issues. I have a lot of respect for that.
Thank you.
So my first question, though, is why can't we do a good portion of this as a revenue bond? I understand that for the ecosystem pieces of it, it's hard to find a beneficiary or any kind of a fee source that might support a revenue bond. So I get that a GEO bond is the right vehicle for some parts of this, but for the water projects themselves, we've done revenue bonds in the past. There certainly are beneficiaries that pay for their water, and so it's not hard to imagine that you could piece together a revenue mechanism that wouldn't burden the general fund. So I wanted to put that question to you.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the question, and as you know, that has been a major concern for some time, really going back all the way to the beginning of our discussions on this, and I think the best way to address that is to, again, take us back over the last 30 years, and when we talk about what happened in the past and how we paid for projects in the past, to accept the realization that we were in a very different place, we as a state, as a nation, relating to our concerns for the environment and what we needed to do or didn't need to do relating to that. And I think everybody would agree, quite frankly, those issues were unfortunately ignored 30 years ago to a great extent. And people didn't take into consideration, if you will, the importance of public benefit. And that's what we have tried to recognize and address in this particular effort, and everything we've moved forward is to say these facilities do have the ability and we hope, will provide general benefit to the environment that we, as Californians in general, should be willing to support, that this is something that shouldn't be necessarily on the back of a group of beneficiaries or users, if you will, but it is important that we have a viable ecosystem in the Delta, and that we should all be supporting that in an appropriate way. So, and I think it's, again, important to point out that none of that money, as it relates to Chapter 8 particularly, which is the largest single portion of project dollars, if you will be spent until that commitment for revenue bonds, which I think most of us assume will only be serviced as a result of additional costs to be borne by the users and their retail clients, that as a result there will be a combination, we think an appropriate combination of revenue and general obligation bond in order, again, at the end of the day, to create facilities that will provide not only a reliable water source moving into the future, but the resource necessary to hopefully provide major improvements to the ecosystem in the Delta, which, again, as I would reiterate, is the major criteria for qualification for any of that money. So, again, none of it's going to be spent on any project unless that project can demonstrate effectively that it will provide that kind of benefit to the ecosystem. So, again, just to restate my position on this, I believe that the infrastructure at the end of the day will represent a combination of revenue and general obligation bonds in the appropriate percentages.
I want to ask you about some of the parts of your bond where, I mean, I get that we do bonds to provide financing, but bonds, once they are approved by the voters, are also hard things to modify. And when we start getting into policy in these bond documents, it makes it very, very hard for this body, or for the state, for that matter, to change course without going back to the voters and all the machinations that are involved in that. So I'm always very leery of wading into new policy areas in a bond, a financing vehicle, if we don't have to. And I see on page 2 of your bill, I'm afraid that from my reading of it, you do that in several places. The first is you refer to in section 13170.3 subsection B, you talk about if the state board in the future changes any water rights decisions that involve reallocations of obligations in the Delta, you legislatively sort of prescribe how those allocations will occur. And this is the first time, to my knowledge, that the legislature or the voters, for that matter, would wade into the details of how the state board administers water rights in the future. So that troubles me, and I would invite you to speak to that. You've got a section immediately following that, again, talks about not affecting water rights priorities, and then you add a pretty significant change to area of origin law from my reading. You appear to take the Delta region out of the area of origin for purposes of some of these projects. So I'm hoping you can speak to each of these policy issues, why they need to be in a bond, and what you're trying to accomplish there.
Right.
I guess I'll just add to that, and in general on policy being in the bond.
Yeah. And those are great points. And again, going back to the original work as we started, I think we spent over a year on this particular section of the language negotiation with the stakeholders to try to come to a negotiated agreement. We did that, and as a result, that language has remained ever since. I will tell you that as a result of, again, the work that has taken place just this year in the area of policy and a lot of what's reflected in Senator Steinberg's policy bill, this is being revisited, if you will, and is one of the areas, as I pointed out in my opening comments, that is still in flux. It's in negotiation. I think a lot of the points that you make are valid and need to be looked at and can possibly be addressed again in a policy bill rather than in the bond. But when we started all this, it's all we had. We didn't have all the policy bills. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but...
Well, and specifically the section that sort of reaffirms area of origin protection for the Sacramento River, but then has a sentence that says the Sacramento River hydrologic region does.
Could you cite which
yeah, it's section 79713. but then goes on to carve out of the Sacramento hydrologic region for purposes of this bill any area within the Delta. That would appear to be a rather new and dramatic policy that would extend area of origin protection to everybody but people within the Delta, and I just want to make sure that's not your intent.
Well, again, the intent, when we started this process, as I again mentioned in my opening comments, was as it related to the area of water rights and area of origin, to make sure we weren't changing anything as it related to that. And the goal in negotiating the language that you see now was to try to achieve that. I think the argument's a legitimate one to say it doesn't appear to us that that's necessarily what you've done. And again, all I can say is that it is an area that has continued to be negotiated, and I'm hopeful at this point we will be able to find a resolution to it.
Okay, thank you.
One last question. Senator Cogdell is going to need to leave in just a few minutes. Seeing no hands being raised. Senator Cogdell, any closing comments?
Just to, again, thank the committee for all of your hard work. You and certainly Chairman Huffman have been working diligently for years also on this issue. And again, I don't think there's anything more important to this state. I think everybody in this room, and quite frankly, I think most people in this state acknowledge that. And I'm just hopeful that we are close to a resolution here, that we can all continue to work over the next few days and hopefully bring this home and do something very, very positive for the future of this state and its water needs. So again, thank you for the opportunity to present the bond, and any other questions anyone has, we'll be more than willing to try to address those. You just give us a call.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Cogdell. Have a good afternoon. The next item on the agenda, we're going to go into a little more depth on proposed financing language and the ongoing costs of operations for the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Conservancy, and other kinds of programs, as well as relating to the bond. So Chairman of the Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Task Force is here, Phil Eisenberg, welcome, and also coming up with the LAO's office, Catherine Freeman and Jason Dickerson join Mr. Eisenberg. And I'm not sure what length of presentation you've decided to do, but maybe something about 10 or 15 minutes.
20 hours would be okay.
Well, about 10 or 15 minutes would be perfect, because we have some questions we would like to ask, and the goal here is to allow enough time for public comment.
Chair, members, thank you very much. Phil Eisenberg, representing the Delta Vision Foundation, which is the successor to the task force that I chaired. As the chair requested, just a general observation. It is a major change in state water policy, maybe a lot of state spending that has to do with use of bonds. If you link policy to the spending, logic would tell you, you decide what the policy is, you go out, you hustle around, find the money, and spend to meet the policy. But traditionally, in California, it hasn't happened that way. Sometimes the bonds are just raising more money to throw at the programs that you've done piecemeal over the years. The complexity of the water puzzle and the Delta ecosystem drives you to try to do, and I commend you for it, something that's remarkably complex, and that is take a wide variety of disparate issues and bring them together in a way that has some plausible hope of providing water for Californians and an improved Delta ecosystem and avoiding another 80 years of contentious political battles and endless litigation. Not easy. So, in fact, if you're stepping back from all the fight and, you're deeply enmeshed in the details of all of this, it is quite remarkable that you now have Senator Steinberg's bill, Ms. Fuller's bill as policy expressions. You've got the two bond alternatives because, in fact, to the great pleasure of the task force, you've actually tried to do what, the blending of policy and financing. And so now we obviously have different suggestions to make. Everybody has different suggestions. But the pattern you're taking is pretty smart. And I would recommend to you that you keep that in mind as you go through these endlessly complicated and very contentious lesser issues. This is a marvelous achievement to get this far. I did not think you would ever be here, and I walked into this building as a young staffer in 1961, and I've watched or participated in every single water battle ever since. And this is the closest the legislature has come to a comprehensive set of policies. As every witness says, would I do it differently if I were in control? Oh, you bet. But all of you would do it differently, too. Anyway, your policy bills, both of the policy bills, in general, identify with the task force recommendations. I mean, both policy bills say, look, let's have the co-equal values of reliable water system and Delta ecosystem. Our suggestion would be, as we said in the task force report, the bond should ratify that. The bond should recognize that. If you're doing policy, then the spending should be consistent with that policy. That's just kind of common sense. The second thing we talked about, Delta's place, the kind of composite issues of recognizing the Delta as a social, cultural, economic entity and an ecosystem as well is important. You know, we had suggested that you create, I think we called it a Delta Impact Fund. Bond funds are appropriate for that. I don't believe either bond bill does that yet, but it's consistent with the approach you're taking. Certainly the ecosystem elements they're different in the policy bills, but they're both there, and they are both appropriate for a portion of bond funding. The water conservation and system efficiencies, which you've been talking about endlessly, and all the water districts will talk to you about because they have their own ranking of priorities as to why groundwater management should come before conjunctive use, which should come before this, because, you know, they all calculate where that would get them on the priority list. The funds are not endless, is important, but it's consistent. We recommended you have to do facilities. Both bills talk about a way to do it. You've got a pretty interesting and I think creative approach on how to integrate the Bay Delta Conservation Plan into the decision-making process. Frankly, I had not thought of that approach, and it has much to recommend it. The reduction of risk in and around the Delta, not only to the water supply system, the existing water conveyance system, but also to the people who live there and their lives and their property and all that, is very important. You've got elements in there. They're different between the bond bills, but the elements are there. And then last is what you invited me to actually talk about, which is the governance, and we had recommended. And both of the policy bills do move toward the creation of a new governance structure to deal with this array of issues. Both policy bills create a Delta Council, Delta Stewardship Council. They do it a little differently, and the terms and conditions are a little different, but they both create it. Both policy bills create a conservancy. Both policy bills tinker and work with the Delta Protection Council, the existing entity, and change and maneuver that array. Both bills approve of the continuation of the scientific program that all the interested parties have said has to be done, that was in CalFed, that's now going to be transferred. And I would just ask you for one thing. Because issues in general terms appear to be resolved, say the science component, please do not forget them, because those are about as important as many of the other things that seem more politically contentious at this time. On the governance issue, we have said previously on the governance ideas, and both bills reflect this, create the council. Tell the council to adopt a Delta plan. Both bills do that. Use the Delta plan as guidance. Both bills kind of do that. We had recommended, of course, that state and local agencies be required to comply with the Delta plan. And there's an argument about whether these bills do that or not. We had suggested the council should be able to determine conformity. And the bills, Senator Steinbild's bill suggests ways in which they do. Ms. Fuller, I apologize, but I was on an airplane last night when yours was released, and I have been unable to successfully plow through it yet to see. But I'd be surprised if there were not elements addressing that issue in that bill, too. Here's what it comes down to, however. What's missing from the financing package in policy level and also in the bond package is anything other than a declaration of good intentions on how to pay for the operations that make all these things happen. I'd rather have a declaration of good intention than nothing at all. But just as an operational issue, you have to, it seems to me, address the question of how all these people you're going to suck into a council, a water commission that's been around but never been had positions
it's
filled,
dormant.
a Delta Conservancy, a Delta Protection Commission with new responsibility, a science team that has some antecedent. How you're going to say, well, okay, all right, short time frame, and you're adopting really short time frames. Okay, go do it. And what's going to happen is the legislative analyst will be on one side of the room and the Department of Finance will be on the other side of the room, and these poor folks you've drafted will sit around and say, well, what do we do? And you say, well, you got to have a meeting. Well, yeah, but you don't have any money to do anything. I just urge you to at least give some consideration to it. And here's the approach we recommended to you. Do not assume that the general fund will pay for much, if anything. You can't, in our judgment, realistically expect that, nor should you in our judgment. You can expect and probably should consider the notion of allocating a portion of general obligation bonds that relate to legitimate activities to pay for those activities. And by the way, that is not just for the Delta Council, although that's important. It's also for the state agencies who you are demanding accelerate their work, their effort, their energy, and produce for you. And so the Water Board, the Department of Fish and Game, even the Department of Water Resources, the other entities that are out there all have obligations you're putting on them that we believe you should put on them, but you have to at least allow them, I think, to have some appropriate amount. I'm not even trying to suggest amounts to you that would relate from a GO bond. In addition, at least for the Delta Council, as you've done for the Water Commission, I think you want to consider, and we had previously recommended that the Delta Council have revenue bond authority. And you say, whoops, I don't want to give them revenue bond. Understand, revenue bond authority requires someone who's willing to pay for it. It is not an authorization for a government agency to borrow. You must find a revenue stream to pay for it. But as you think of the tools that everybody's going to need, that's a tool that over time will be useful for the water supply system and the ecosystem, and it's an option in our judgment you ought to consider. And then last, we'd recommended that the Water Council has to have fee authority because realistically over time, it's hard to imagine that an agency can do as Ms. Fuller, again, I apologize, but I assume your bill has the 5-year review of the Delta plan in it. It may not, but every other version has so far. I think it does. It's hard to imagine that you can have that kind of ongoing oversight and not have some source of revenue other than general obligation bonds, which are facility related, which is important and can get you through a certain period of time, but it can't get you through forever. So that's all out there. I think they're all important. You've heard me say before that I thought you had somewhere from a 10 to 20% chance of success on this entire effort. And I've been stopping myself from increasing the probability. But the fact of the matter is, from the first time I walked into that 8-week marathon you had where most of you were sitting in a room for 2 hours and talking to each other, and I told you then and I tell you now, not in my entire 40 years of watching and being in the legislature had I ever seen as large a number of members pay as much attention for as long a period of time. I mean, truly, it's remarkable. This is a place where you get 3 minutes to think about important issues and nothing else. And you've exhibited a very level of seriousness that I think is commendable. But I think you've got to crack the financing puzzle. And Madam Chair, may I just say one other thing? All bond bills of necessity also involve state policy and they involve intricate local issues. And we are deliberately not going to get involved in the fights among you about regional allocations and all that other stuff. I'd be foolish indeed to try that and get my head chopped off for the effort if I wanted to. Last, and I'll just close. Important as big as this bond issue is, it's just a down payment. And I'm sure you understand. Ask the legislative analysts, for example, to explain the operational and bond cost of maintaining the state highway system on an ongoing basis. What are we up? $2-3 billion a year? They have their own dedicated fund sources. The water system is no less complex than the transportation system or the higher education system of California. And this is a down payment, and it's an important down payment, but it's a start of a long process. So anyway, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for your perspective and your tremendous efforts, Mr. Eisenberg. 18 months of the Delta Vision report? 20 months, but
20.
who's counting? And then
Yeah, but who's counting?
the last 8 months with us every time we've asked. Thank you very much. LAO perspective, please.
Thank you. Catherine Freeman with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and thanks for letting us come here and talk to you. What I'd like to do is, I think most folks have heard us talk a little bit about water project financing and the different types of financing that we can do. What I'd like to do is kind of go through that presentation, but add in the impacts of this bill. And there are times when I'm not going to be able to be specific. We just reviewed the bonds this morning, and we'd like to give you a more detailed fiscal analysis. But I think in general, we can answer your questions, and we can maybe address some of the concerns that the committee has, both committees have. So we've talked about the three different approaches to financing. We have pay-as-you-go, renting and leasing, and bond financing. I think the important thing to note, and Mr. Eisenberg really addressed this as well, is when we talk about bond financing, this is really only part of the package. And it's an important part of the package. But our recommendation has always been that bond financing be used for capital investments, long-lived capital facilities that we can look at in several years and know that they're there and they're still standing in whatever shape or form they take. The big part of the package that seems to be elusive or still in progress is the pay-as-you-go. So for the policy bill, there are a number of positions that are added that we will have to address in the budget process, and that includes water rights, anything that has to do with the state impacts on groundwater monitoring, also the Delta Councils and the Delta Protection Commission. There aren't specific financing mechanisms for these, and we do recommend that the beneficiaries pay, but determining who those beneficiaries are can be very difficult. It may be that the general taxpayer is the beneficiary in some cases, and it may be that there are specific individuals or areas that receive water that should pay for those. So that's just a broad way of looking at it, but I think that they're important issues to go through. In terms of the beneficiary pays policy, the bond itself is, the bonds that we've looked at are about $9.4 billion. There is no payback mechanism for those, as we've seen. So at that point, if the legislature were to pass those bills, in general, the policy might be that the general taxpayer is the beneficiary of all of those bonds. We think that there is another way to look at bonds, and we've done so before in terms of the State Water Project. The State Water Project was paid back in part by the general taxpayer, but mostly by the beneficiaries of the projects. The beneficiaries of the projects are about 2/3 of the state. So when we add in the general taxpayer, we're only adding in about 1/3 more, but it's important to note that those beneficiaries that receive the benefits of the projects paid the majority of those costs. We do this not just in the State Water Project, but also in flood control projects. And an important aspect not only of the bond, but also of the policy bills is the cost sharing. So I think if we talk about the general affordability of the package, we need to look at both, so the three components. We have the general taxpayers paying something, the beneficiaries, direct beneficiaries are paying another portion, and then there's a cost share component. Now, the cost share doesn't have to be locals. It can be the federal government, which would be a pleasant surprise, a movement in a forward direction. However, we do need to acknowledge that there are more than a few components to this package. The more specificity the package can give, the better off we are at the outset, because it's hard to go back later and say, okay, well, we're not really sure who the beneficiaries are, and as Mr. Eisenberg pointed out, we need to move quickly on this. So how do we get those folks to pay their fair share, and whether they're the general taxpayer or whether they are a smaller subset, to get them to be able to pay their fair share. I think also we need to look at how locals have financed their packages. They have done the same type of approach. They've really looked at both a cost share, so their cost share we're paying into their programs, they have their pay-as-you-go, so they're general ratepayer, and then many of them have property taxes as well. And so it's not unheard of that we have all of these different disparate groups, but we need to figure out how to move forward and get them on board. The next thing I wanted to talk about is bonds. So in the last several years, we've had a dramatic increase in bonds in the resources area. This has peaked in 2006 with about almost $10 billion worth of bonds issued. This has made bonds a significant program in the resources area. If we were to pass a $9.4 billion bond, bonds would become the second largest program in resources, second only to wildland firefighting. Without a new revenue source, if we just look in our small world of resources and environmental protection, that's a huge increase in costs, and we don't, in that area, have the trade-off of general fund to pay for that. So the question is, and Mr. Dickerson may get into this as well, where else are we going to look? Are we going to look to education, health, prisons? What other area of the state are we going to look to? And that it's not necessarily meant to deter the bond discussion. It just means that it needs to be out there. It needs to be a part of the final decision-making process. Finally, there was something in the bonds that I thought was actually a good movement, and that was to reappropriate some of the funding from previous bonds. And as to the merits of the exact policy for reappropriation, that I'm not going to speak to that. But looking back at previous bonds and taking a portion that seems reasonable for the legislature to reappropriate and move forward is a good move. And I think in both bonds, I'm fairly certain there's a couple $100 million from previous bonds that moves into these bonds. I would also like to talk a little bit about CalFed. And this is to sort of give some endorsement to the movement that's been made on these policy bills. With CalFed, the priorities weren't clear. The performance measurement was lacking. And in the end, the folks who ran CalFed admitted that a lot of things just didn't work very well. And we had a few recommendations that we thought would help any future Delta policy. And that was to address the governance problem. Well, the Council and the Delta Protection Commission and the intricacies of their workings does seem to move that forward. To set expenditure priorities. In this case, I would suggest stronger priorities be set, but there are priorities in both the bonds and in the policy bill that have begun to address that. Establish performance measures that tie to the budget bills. So in the end, every appropriation, except for those that are continuously appropriated in the bonds, will go through the budget and will have to be determined whether they can be put into a budget bill. If the policy bill sets forth expenditure priorities, that certainly helps the budget committees as they decide how much can be spent and how many personnel years we should really add to these programs. And then finally, having a financing framework. CalFed didn't work because there wasn't a financing framework. The partners weren't there, the beneficiaries weren't paying, and the cost share didn't seem to exist. So we need to move forward with all of these pieces together and hopefully come up with a package that works. All of that said, the package is fairly comprehensive. It's fairly sweeping, and it does move us forward in a way that California Water hasn't been moved forward in recent years. And so we'd be happy to answer questions. Jason Dickerson from our office is also here to talk more about bonds and debt financing.
Jason Dickerson from the Analyst Office. As you know, the state faces very significant ongoing fiscal problems in its general fund, which funds most state-funded services and transfers tens of billions of dollars to local governments and school districts. Those problems are ongoing. They're not temporary. Based on the current forecasts for economics and revenue activity, the state faces ongoing general fund deficits of billions of dollars a year, perhaps over $10 to $15 billion a year for the foreseeable future. The packages before you would place before voters $9.4 billion of general obligation bond authorization, apparently to be paid largely, if not entirely, from the general fund, which is in such a rough shape right now. One of the features, as Senator Cogdill explained, is that these bonds would specify, this bond act would specify that at least half of the bonds could not be sold before 2015. That would have the benefit from the state's budgetary perspective of spacing out the incurring of new debt service costs for the general fund budget to later years. So it would not bring all of the $600 million or so of debt service that might be incurred under this bond package online all at once. Rather, that $600 million of new costs for the general fund would not hit the books until after 2015. Between now and 2015, if the voters approve this bond authorization, the general fund cost, it appears, would rise to several $100 million a year over that period potentially, and then peak around $600 million more a year, a decade or more from now. When the legislature and voters pass general obligation bonds without a repayment mechanism, it means that you're specifying that those bond payments, those projects that you're funding, are a priority over your other programs, over your other obligations. And so that means that with our general fund facing severe limitations for the foreseeable future, that you and your successors will face the following choices in order to meet the payments on those bonds. You will either have to cut programs and services more than you're already going to have to, or you will have to raise new revenues and taxes, or some combination of those two. Those will be your choices. $600 million, which would be the peak debt service on these bonds after 2015, to put it in perspective, for this year's budget would be about 3 times the budget for the general fund budget for the Healthy Families Program, about half of the general fund IHSS budget, about a quarter of the budget from the general fund for each of the university systems. It would be about 1/6 of the general fund budget for the community colleges this year. It would be equivalent to around a 0.2% additional increase in the vehicle license fee. It would be a small percentage increase for the personal income tax or the sales and use tax. So those will be the choices that you and your successors would face if the voters approve this. Basically, you are already going to have to cut programs and services or raise taxes in order to balance the budget each year. You will have to do that by about $600 million more after 2015 if the voters approve the types of measures that are now before you without a repayment mechanism.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Questions by members? Thank you very much for your presentations. And questions are open by members to any of the 3 that made the presentations regarding financing. Senator Hollingsworth.
If I could just follow on your presentation, though, you're not looking at this bond, or we shouldn't be looking at this bond in a vacuum, and the debt service on this bond in a vacuum. What is the amount of debt service per budget year that will be retired and coming off of our obligations each year between now and 2015 when it would reach that peak of $600 million?
I believe that under the bond measures that the voters have already approved, just looking now at the Treasurer's recent debt affordability report, I believe that debt service costs would be rising each year through at least 2013 or 2014 with the bonds that have already been authorized. It is true, as Senator Cogdill has pointed out, that the legislature could take action to slow down the issuance of already approved bonds for education, higher education, housing, transportation, and other purposes. A lot of the projects that are funded through those bonds, however, have pretty long planning periods. So if that would be the financing approach that you would like to take with this water bond, it would be helpful for the legislature to enact into law either policy or intent that just as water bonds ramp up, perhaps other bonds would be issued more slowly than they otherwise would. But under the Treasurer's projections, for instance, outstanding and already authorized bond debt service would grow from around $6 billion this year to around $9.5 billion in 2014-15. Thereafter, it would decrease, and you're correct. That essentially, then, what may occur would be that water bond debt service would play a larger role in our debt service structure after 2015. If that's the case, then you might face the decision of there being fewer dollars flowing into capital outlay for schools, universities, roads, and the like.
The $600 million debt service on this bond would only peak after 2015 because of the provision that says that no more than half of the bond's authorized amount could be issued before 2015. So it's not a direct one-for-one that you would have $600 million a year after the voters approved this. And it's not as though that $600 million would be just placed on top of our existing bond debts in a static manner. The bond debts and the debt service associated with those will be peaking just before 2015 and start to come down as the bond debt service for the water bond would be coming onto line, correct?
That's correct. Those are for already outstanding and authorized bonds. So in that structure, you're not really assuming future bond authorizations for all of the other purposes that the state funds, bond-funded projects. I think it all comes back to if the voters approve this package and you don't have a repayment mechanism that is built in there, the legislature and the voters would be stating that this would be a priority. The general fund's budget problems continue out into the foreseeable future. And so I think that whether it be that maybe there'll be less bonds issued in the future for education or other purposes or less program purposes, this will add to the cost of the general fund. And as you say, they wouldn't peak until after 2015. And that is a benefit for the affordability of these bonds in the near term, but it would add to those pressures that you and your successors will face in those years.
Yes. Mr. Anderson, Assemblymember Anderson.
Have you looked at any of the economic offsets as we start moving forward? Will there be any economic impacts that would generate revenue to the state that could be an offset at all on this?
I think clearly improved water infrastructure is critical to California's continued economic success. I don't think that neither we nor anyone else can adequately model the types of changes that far out that come from these types of changes, but no doubt about it, whether it be water infrastructure, road infrastructure, school and universities, or other types of infrastructure, it's all a critical ingredient to California being a place where families and businesses work and invest. No doubt about it.
Senator Bulk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to ask Catherine Freeman some questions about just overall costs of the package. There's been a wide range of numbers that have been cited, certainly in our hearing at the Select Committee, and you attended that. The amounts were very broad and very staggering, both for the canal and for the package as a whole. Do you have any analyses yet on the cost of the package as it's being presented, as it has been presented, and including the canal?
We don't. We have just received the final piece of this, which is the bond. But we can go through some of the pieces, and I can do that sort of in a cursory manner, and I hope that's okay, without giving exact numbers. But when we took some basics, so we take and I'm going to round up because adding in front of a committee can be difficult. $10 billion, and if you take a $10 billion bond, and I'll give the $600,000 back, and you add the debt service onto it, it's about a $20 billion cost. And again, we're not talking about a 30-year bond anymore. We're talking about 30 to 40-year bond. You add a low-cost $5 billion conveyance structure with debt service, that gets to be about $10 billion. And again, 30, 40 years out. The part of the component that is difficult to figure out is what is a ratepayer going to pay in one area or another. And that's when we start talking about the cost shares and the beneficiary pays. There are pieces of this that will necessarily have to be paid for by beneficiaries. State water project costs will likely go up. And there have been quotes that ratepayers in Southern California will see a 10% increase in their rates. I would probably think that it's a bit more than that. Because if you're talking about 30 or $40 billion, even over 40 years, that's quite a bit of money to add to the beneficiaries. Even if the general taxpayer takes on some of this, for one individual, when they pay both their taxes and their bills, and I have water bills, it adds up to more than a 10% increase. And so the true answer is that no, we haven't done a full fiscal analysis, and I think that would help the package, because the package as it is has enough components that there would be benefits down the road. And there are both infrastructure and water reliability benefits to the package. However, not knowing what the trade-offs would be in terms of the total cost would make it so that we don't know whether we're finding the least cost option. And it's our recommendation, it has been our recommendation, that when we look to infrastructure and we look to capital investment, we do try to find the least cost option. The Department of Water Resources has a plethora of least cost options, and they recommend a mix of options for water supply. When we looked at it, their least cost options were water recycling and groundwater and water conservation. Those can't be done in a vacuum. And so the package, as it were, needs to be looked at in its totality. And the beneficiaries, whether they're ratepayers or whether they're the general taxpayer, need to be taken into consideration.
Ms. Freeman, Mr. Keitlinger from Metropolitan on Monday
6 to 12.
Yeah, estimated between 8 and 12 was the cost of the conveyance structure, and that would result in 20% increase for urban customers, and I believe greater for agricultural customers. What I want to ask about is what happens if it's all of the other costs, the economic mitigations that are going to be covered in the public monies in the bonds. What happens if it ends up being more expensive, which it will, and so will the mitigations. That's the way it goes. Does something have to be written into this that indicates who has what responsibility for overruns, or what was,
I think that
what have we done historically?
I think that the best way to monitor funding is to make sure that whatever appropriations you're looking at go through the budget bill. And it may not be the perfect mechanism these days, but it is the legislature's oversight over expenditures. Now, certainly there are parts that folks want to carve out for continuous appropriation. But for the majority of the funding that goes out, there needs to be a stop for the legislature to say, wait, is this really our funding priority this year and next year and 5 years out? And certainly because you're creating an overall policy package, the future legislatures can look back to that and say, well, we had somewhere that we were going from, and there'll be a direction and a path. But we do need to look at some way to rein back in costs when they go overrun. As to who pays for it, the Department of Water Resources has amended contracts with the State Water Project many times. And to give a specific percentage as to how much it's going to cost either the urban or the agriculture or the industrial water contractors would be difficult to do. And I appreciate that he's done as good as he can, but it will be difficult to look out 10, 15, 20 years to see what the ratepayers will be paying.
I didn't say that. Thank you, Ms. Freeman. I wanted to ask you about the current policy package, and in the very end of the policy package is a description of the continuous funding, continuously appropriated funding. What I'm curious about, it's on page 113, of the policy package in the back.
7.
Oh, the 7X.
Would you explain some of that to me? What I'm curious about is what projects, where is this money being taken from? It is Prop 84 and 1E funding, or just 84, and what will be foregone when we use it for this? And what is the continuous appropriation money referring to in Section 77?
And if it's all right, Senator Wilk, because that Prop 84 was one of my list of questions.
Oh, good.
It's just the legality of using a voter-approved initiative in a category for different purposes.
Well, two things. I'm not going to read the bill in front of you, but I will. Let me answer broadly and see if that helps, and then we can go into some details.
I appreciate that.
Continuous appropriation means that the legislature doesn't generally have oversight over the funding.
Oh, I know what it means. I think we all do.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to what it applies to here.
So for these, I'm not actually sure of the specifics of what they're going into. The legality, though, if a voter-approved bond is changed in a future bond and the voters approve it, then the voters have amended their bond or their language. So it's our understanding that is the type of thing that is generally allowable. It's very difficult for the legislature to go back and amend a bond, but
Senator Wolk's asking about a policy bill that's reprogramming some of that prior voter-approved bond money.
Correct.
Right. If the policy bill goes and reprograms it, there are questions of legality. If the purpose has not strayed too far from what the voters approved, it is possible to reprogram the money. However, they do need to be very close together unless a bond specifically says it's not allowable.
And my question was the 2.5 pages of accounts that are listed. Is there a way of figuring out what projects then fall off the list?
We can, and that's something that we can take a look at and get you some specifics when we come back to you.
I'd appreciate
as soon as
that.
we can.
Okay, I have one other question, and you raised it in your comments, or your answer actually to me to the first question. Have you or has anyone that you know been asked to compare the costs of what is being proposed in the Delta package with the cost of the kinds of reliability projects that many of the water agencies throughout the state are looking to do? Desalination, cleaning up groundwater, recycling. Has there ever been that kind of comparative cost-benefit analysis?
I think to answer your question, I think folks have tried in part, but I don't think that anyone's ever really done a comprehensive look at specifically this package, but the general broader package versus all of the proposals that both the Department of Water Resources has listed as cost-effective types of water programs. And to be sure, it's difficult even to look at their numbers and say, well, this is the least cost avenue. For example, for groundwater, it's listed as one of the least cost avenues for storage. Well, that is only true if the groundwater's not contaminated. And as the Water Supply Agency, they don't necessarily look at that in depth as one who had a local interest in groundwater. So the answer to your question is probably not. But I think it's critically important as we move forward to look at the trade-offs and to ask the direct beneficiaries if they're willing to pay for either the policy package or the bond package, and if it meets their needs as well, because there are cheaper options for every local area, but they may not be in the best interest of the state, and vice versa is also true.
Thank you very much.
Good questions. Senator Simitian, followed by Assemblymember Huffman.
Just a comment. The previous question, I think, presupposes the fact that it's either or, and I think long-term the answer may well be that California will be obliged to check off the box that says all of the above. I think we are often tempted to look for the single answer or the cure-all in the course of these conversations, but I think when we look at the long-term growth projections for the state of California, the water needs of the state writ large over time, we're not going to have the luxury of picking and choosing between or among the list that's before us.
Appreciate your comment, Senator Simitian, but Senator Wilk says she will just briefly has to respond.
I do. I agree with that. And I think one of the things that I'd like to see stronger in the policy package, especially for the BDCP, is that requirement. That, in fact, these kinds of alternatives should be considered, not just size, scope of the canal or not. There should be alternatives. $1 billion gets you this versus $1 billion of ditch.
All right. Assemblymember Huffman, followed by Assemblymember Yamada.
There she goes again. Promoted again.
Didn't I say Assemblymember?
No, you did great. Thank you.
Did I elevate you again to?
You started to, but then you
Congressman Huffman?
reined it right in. I have a few questions, I think, for probably any of the panelists. I want to start with the amount of the debt service, because when we waded into this bond issue over a year ago for the first time, at least for me, we were told that on a bond that was in the $9 billion plus range, if memory serves, I think we were told the debt service was going to be about $680 million annually. That was before, of course, we attained the worst credit rating in the United States. And so I've just been assuming since that time that we're going to have a higher debt service on the same amount of borrowing today because our credit is not as good. But if I am incorrect about that, I hope somebody will disabuse me of that idea.
There are many factors that go into the state's debt service rates on a particular bond issue. I think the reality of the matter is, for a bond of this size, the peak annual debt service could be somewhere between $500 and $700 million, depending on what the market conditions are at the time that they're issued. I picked $600 million. That's around a 5% average, but it could be higher. It could actually be lower. One of the key variables that goes in the interest rate is just what broader interest rates are in the economy. Right now, they're very low. But they may well be higher in the future due, among other things, to the federal government's fiscal policy, which may put upward pressure on interest rates in the future.
Okay.
But I think you are correct. It's possible it could be more towards $700 million. It's possible it could be lower than $600 million, but it's in that range.
Okay. The second question, again, following up on this issue of a general obligation bond. Treasurer Lockyer has suggested that if we did a bond of this size on water at this time, that it very well, by virtue of our depressed revenue conditions in the state, it very well could put us into a situation where we have to ration previously approved bonds. And I'm not a CPA, I don't know how all this works, but he suggested that, for example, high-speed rail may not be able to happen if we jam ourselves in a way that forces us to ration previously approved bonds, or school construction may not be able to happen. Obviously, that's something that's going to be of great concern to a lot of members, and so I wonder if you could sort of speak to that.
I think we have rising concerns about that possibility. One of the duties of our office when bond measures go before the voters is to prepare an analysis of the state's debt burden in the voter information guide. And if you go back to prior versions of that guide, 2008, for example, we were looking at peak debt service being in the range of 6% of general fund budget, sometimes less. Because the voters approved the 2006 bond authorizations and revenues since then have dropped substantially, we are now looking at the very real possibility that in the next few years, as the Treasurer has pointed out, that our debt service may climb to above 10% of our general fund expenditures. This is completely unprecedented for California. There is no single right amount for that ratio. I don't think, I don't think that sophisticated investors or anyone else would tell you 10% is the right number, 5% is the right number, 15% is the right number. Rather, what investors, what Wall Street, if you will, are looking at is the ability of this legislature and the governor to balance the budget each and every year, no matter what the debt service ratio is. But all that being said, our debt burden is rising to a level that is not precedented. We have already, in the past few months, had difficulty issuing as many bonds as we might have liked. Last spring, we issued more bonds that we might have liked. But I think that when you look at the overall picture, particularly the state's fiscal realities, its ability to pay debt service every year while meeting its other programmatic obligations, we are beginning to look at the possibility that that bond issuance may have to slow down from what has been assumed in the past. That is a new thing for California, and I think the Treasurer is correct. That is a rising possibility now. One of the very interesting features of this bond proposal is that at least half of the bond principal would have to be issued after 2015, and that definitely helps the state afford it more. One of the things I would caution, though, is that by putting so much of the bond sales out that long, it's difficult to know what exactly you and the voters would be buying with this issue. Inflation will erode the purchasing power of that $9.4 billion the longer that it takes to issue those bonds. And so, on the one hand, that feature helps make these bonds more affordable than if that $9.4 billion were all issued before 2015. On the other hand, it makes it harder to know what you're buying.
I want to ask the LAO, but also particularly Mr. Eisenberg, about this idea, because we've talked about revenue bonds and general obligation bonds, and what is being proposed for a substantial portion of Senator Cogdill's bond is something we've never done before, to my knowledge, and that is to take infrastructure projects to ascribe a public benefit portion of that project and make that something that we could fund with the general obligation bond, and then to define what qualifies as public benefit. And this is something that it's a novel idea that was proposed, I think, by the governor and Senator Feinstein for the first time a little over a year ago, and I was intrigued by it. However, I was intrigued when we were pretty narrowly defining what those public benefits were. And one of the things that seems to have changed pretty consistently as this bond has evolved is that we've broadened the definition of public benefits. So we're taking projects that historically would have never even been appropriate for general obligation bonds, adding this new creative public benefit formula to them, and then continually broadening what qualifies as public benefit. So, for example, now we have emergency response, which effectively means if you can have a helicopter dip a bucket in a reservoir and fight a fire, that's now public benefit for the entire state.
Reservoirs.
We have recreation, which means if you can water ski on it, the entire state is now going to help you pay for it. So, I sort of see an erosion of what otherwise was an interesting kernel of possibility for me on a creative approach, and I wondered if you could sort of speak to the propriety of this expanding definition of public benefit and the use of a general obligation bond for infrastructure in that manner.
Or historical perspectives.
Historical perspective, when I was mayor of Sacramento, starting in 1975, we were horrified to have a bond debt ratio for the city that exceeded 3%, which everyone assured us would be rejected by all the lenders in America. They weren't. And I have gone through in my life estimations of whatever a trigger or threshold is, and they never seem to really be met, except maybe when you get to be like the city of New York did during the mid-1970s, where they borrowed to pay their operational cost, but that was close to a crime, so that's different. The task force came very close to what Senator Simitian described as the long-term future as you look out 20, 30 years. Forget all the details. You're going to be doing a lot of all of it. And the problem is how to create a system that minimizes demands on either general fund money or general obligation bonds. And this is not fully responsive, Mr. Huffman, but it might be illustrative. You know that in fixing up the Delta, the public's going to pick up a piece of the Delta ecosystem. We'd thrown a couple of recommendations in the task force report for things you ought to consider that offer the chance of lowering the cost. So, for example, mitigation and conservation banking, which is well known around the state of California. It would be, we thought, useful to have a simple declaration that the council could engage in banking as a device, which does indirectly lead to a lowering of demand on general fund. The same thing on carbon offsets. Many of the Delta Islands, as you know, offer the potential for carbon offsets. Well, a clear statement that says shall pursue and, if appropriate, include a carbon offset component in the ecosystem planning may well minimize those additional costs. But having said that, I'm also, and I think Senator Simitian is too, I think we're increasingly convinced that as time goes on, all the pressures you feel are going to lead a lot of the water users into a somewhat greater reliance on some form of revenue bonds for both water projects and other things. It seems to me unavoidable. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, will that prevent the same people from coming in to talk to all of you, asking that somebody pick up a greater share of the cost? Of course not. But the history of big water deals in California, God, they only come every 20 or 30 years at the most. And it's not going to, let's assume you do something significant this year. You will be fed up with all of us, and you won't want anybody to come back and talk to you about water. And that suggests that all the great protestations that are out there, people are going to have their own projects, their own ideas. So another way to reduce possible demands on general fund and GO bonds, in our view, is to consider authorizing the revenue bond participation, say for the council, as a tool. Nothing's perfect. Nothing's the absolute solution, Mr. Simitian's point. And all of them offer threats. But, a deteriorating ecosystem and no way to improve the water system of California is a heavy-duty threat, not just an ordinary political threat.
And I want to thank you, before I hear from the LAO on the issue about the GO bond and public benefits, I want to thank you for continuing to push us towards providing fee authority and the appropriate financing tools such as revenue bond authority for the new council, because I happen to agree with you. I would love to see it in what we've got right now, but certainly whether it's in now or not, eventually we're going to need it.
So I'll give you two very short perspectives on public benefit. One is, and I'm not going to pick on Metropolitan Water District this time. I'm going to use PG&E or SMUD. So very close by, folks. We all in this area, if we live here, pay into our SMUD bills. I also know that they own several reservoirs up in the foothills in the Sierras that I've visited, and my bills pay for the environmental mitigation of those reservoirs. The state of California in general does not pay for the recreation benefits or otherwise. The ratepayers and the visitors to those areas pay all of the recreation benefits, and I think it's a model that's been used around the country, and I think it's a pretty good model. It's mitigation, and that's why they allow recreation on their reservoirs. It's to let those of us who would like to benefit from our Sierras use them. The alternative to that is the 1960 State Water Project bond, where recreation mitigation was an interesting concept at that time, but it wasn't as fleshed out as it is today. And we, at that time, the state, had recreation be a public benefit. And it was stated, it was the intent of the legislature that the ratepayers wouldn't pay for recreation. Well, that was part of the mitigation for the State Water Project at the time. It has come to pass that the state now pays a significant amount of recreation through the state parks programs and otherwise through the general fund. But we also pay, and I'm not going to go into the details of a Davis-Dulwig Act, but we pay a percentage off the top of our the ratepayers pay a percentage off the top of the State Water Project that they believe is owed to them by the general fund. And for a long time, their bills did say that it was owed by the state of California. So there's two different models. The public can be the beneficiary, but that would be essentially a mitigation measure. Or the ratepayers and those who have specific interests can be the beneficiary. And neither model is perfect.
Mm-hmm. But this is a third model that we're talking about now, because this is talking about public benefits not as mitigation but as part of a project purpose.
That's right.
And so I was interested in your thoughts of the viability of that entire model first, and then second, the viability of that model with the definition of public benefits kind of expanding.
Well, for the State Water Project, one of the project purposes was declared as recreation. And as we read it today, that probably was part of the negotiations to help the State Water Project get passed.
Is that Shasta?
That would be Lake Oroville, houseboats on Lake Oroville, that type of thing. Nowadays, we do things just slightly differently. There's no reason that you can't go back to that model, but it would likely need to be stated as a purpose in the policy bill or in the bond.
We had two other people in front of you. Assemblymember Yamada, and then Assemblymember Arambula, followed by Senator Huff, which hopefully is about the end for this session.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And
Assemblymember
Senator Huff, did you have something specific? I'd be happy to defer if you have a specific question. All right, thank you very much. I wanted to go back to something that I believe Mr. Dickerson raised about the issue of prioritization. That is to say, should the voters, wherever this all ends up and it becomes approved by the voters, that it would establish new priorities for the use of our general fund. And, I remember a California Budget Project presentation not related to this discussion, but some other discussions that I participated in, saying that the principal uses of the general fund today are to medicate, educate, and incarcerate. But should these bonds be approved, then we would add irrigate to that, I would guess. As you have studied the increased burdens upon the general fund and debt service, did you also include various entitlement program projected expansions, for example, for IHSS, which is an entitlement program under the law, OPEBs, other post-employment benefits, pension? Did you have demographics as part of the analysis on the continued burdens and potential burdens upon the general fund?
Well, earlier when I was talking about the scale of debt service relative to the budget for programs, those were literally this year's budget for those programs. I will say the fiscal condition in which the state finds itself will make it very difficult for the state to expand budgets for particular programs for the foreseeable future. But those were just 2009-10 numbers to give a sense of the scale of $600 million in the state budget. So I would say as well that debt service is really essentially, while our Constitution doesn't quite read this way, for all intents and purposes, debt service is the first thing we fund. So when voters approve bonds, they're basically saying we're going to pay that no matter what, even if university fees have to be raised, even if health programs have to be cut, debt service is going to be paid. That's the lay of the land.
Well, and then I don't know, maybe we could have any other answer from the LAO's office. In any of these analyses, were demographic shifts in the state of California taken into consideration with the, frankly, the aging out of the state of California, increases in responsibilities that this state will have towards our older citizens who will become, our responsibility?
I think to try to get to the question
later,
you've
only done it for 1 year.
In mid-November, we will be updating our 5-year fiscal forecast, and one of the things that we look at in that forecast that affects the caseload of health and social service programs, for instance, are the demographics, the expected growth of certain age groups. I think that gets to your question. So when we put out that analysis in mid-November, we'll be giving you an update on what the potential caseload for programs is. And I think that should you and the voters approve this bond measure, and it is to be repaid from general fund resources, this debt service will basically go into the mix, and it will add to the pressure that you and your successors have to balance the general fund budget each year and to maintain programs that serve the rising elderly population and so forth.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Arambula.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the risk of pontificating on this, we heard irrigate, and now I run the risk of pontificate. But
as long as you don't prevaricate.
That's right. I vaguely recall in macroeconomics that we need to do cost-benefit analysis. And this is in relation to the comment or the line of questions about the cost of funding a proposed bond measure. Let me mention the cost of not doing anything, because that's real. What would be the cost to our state economy if the delta were to collapse because of an earthquake, which could happen any time, and water service were interrupted for a period of 2 or 3 years? That would undoubtedly be in the billions of dollars, would it not? Just in my county alone in this past year, there have been several $100 million lost because of the lack of availability of water. And I suspect if we did a survey starting down in San Diego, where they've been stumping avocado trees through the Central Coast and other parts of the state, we would find that the cost of not having adequate and reliable supplies of water, in fact, equal, if not exceed, the cost of a bond repayment that would provide for a reliable, sustainable source of water. I guess the one point I want to make is, if the issue before us is whether we place a bond measure on the ballot. If we place it on the ballot, it's up to the voters to make that decision. It's up to the voters, just like it was this last November when they approved high-speed rail. Prop 84. That was passed by the voters. We didn't vote on. It got on the ballot, and now we're paying for it. There's nothing that we can do. If we were to say, you know what, this bond might cost too much money, so let's not do it. What assurance do we have that a group of citizens won't go out there, gather signatures, put something on the ballot, and wind up costing us as much, if not more, for something that has a lesser value than adequate, sustainable supplies of water? Prop 1E, we put on the ballot as a legislature. You know, the Santa Monica Conservancy, the Coastal Conservancy, that's paying for all kinds of other things that, arguably, at least from my perspective, have a lower priority in terms of the potential economic impact on our state. And, I've tried to raise the argument that the lack of adequate supplies of water are harming people in the state. Certainly, in my part of, in my region of the state, we are the canary in the coal mine. We have unemployment rates, official unemployment rates, that don't acknowledge the vast majority of ag workers are in fact undocumented and don't even show up on the official rates, but the official rates are 40 to 50% unemployment. That has real consequences for those communities and for that region. And we are the canary in the coal mine, because what's happening to us now, if we don't find a solution through a bond or some other way, is going to ripple right on down, all the way down to San Diego. And so I just wanted to point out, at the risk of pontificating, that if we're going to be looking at the cost of a bond, let's do a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, because the cost of not doing something could easily exceed whatever cost there is entailed in placing a measure before the voters.
You made a valid point on looking at the economic costs. I think part of the discussion today, whether it was geo bonds or revenue bonds, or there are other approaches, but thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate them. Senator Huff, followed by Assemblymember Caballero, and last person will be Senator Wolf, and then we'll get to public comment.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond briefly to a couple of comments my colleagues have said. First, Assemblymember Huffman doesn't seem to be here, but he was talking about in the category of priority of bonds, he used the term curtailed, and I don't think we were talking about curtailing. We were talking about spreading out the time period so that they would still be sold. And is that your understanding of how this conversation was going?
I think that what the Treasurer was referring to was essentially deferring the planned issuance cycle for other types of bonds and essentially spreading them out over a longer period. I will say that occasionally there are portions of bond authorizations that, for whatever reason or another, never get spent. But those
Can't
are
find the
small.
right categorical applications or something.
But we're talking about school buildings, university buildings, roads. Those two tend to get spent. But the issue the Treasurer raised, and potentially correctly, is that they may have to be spent over a longer period than was otherwise planned.
And I think that's a prudent approach. If you have competing needs, and perhaps some are more, we would argue that this is more important. It's certainly infrastructure and water is something that we put off for 30 years, and we need to anticipate the future. In going to the public benefits, recreation, it may be a light use, but I don't think we should discount that because as our population grows, there's more need for recreation. We don't have recreation, bad things happen. You have higher crime and other stuff. It's one of those public safety valves. I think that benefits society in perhaps less tangible ways, but more importantly, in the emergency response. We've had a lot of fires in the last few years. The state's had to spend a lot of money for that. That's all of us. And so therefore you can make an argument that if we are finding a way to store more surface water, and yes, it is available for a bucket of a helicopter or a super scooper or whatever it is, that there is a public benefit being conveyed. But I think something we haven't really talked about and more important is the flexibility that it gives to our water system. And that flexibility is really the public benefit because whether global warming is caused by humans or sunspots or whatever, if you're able to capture more of the runoff and use it to put into the aquifer or fight the fires, then that's a benefit that the whole state has. And I go back to what Mr. Dickerson said, that water infrastructure is critical to California's economic success. And I wholeheartedly agree to that. I also am puckering at the price, I just got to tell you, but in the vast scheme of things, I don't see how we cannot go forward in this area.
Right, thank you. Assemblymember Caballero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words. I want to commend Senator Cogdell for presenting his bond today. We have an opportunity to compare it to some of the other bonds that have been put together, and it's important because I think it's a critical piece of whatever we do here. As we look at a comprehensive package, we need financing. There's just no question about it. And I can't underscore the need to get started on the Delta fixes as quickly as possible because we can come up with the governance, we can get that moving. It's going to take a period of time for all of the entities to start to get into operation. Let me give you a real quick example that may seem real off the wall, but when I got to this legislature 3 years ago in this December, one of the biggest issues that we were looking at was an E. coli contamination in my district. And at the time, I proposed legislation to put together a research project so that we could figure out where that E. coli contamination came from, because the bottom line is we didn't have enough scientific information, and I wanted a science-based approach to the solution. Well, the governor thought it was such a good idea that he put it together without legislation, got it started, and so that was in the spring of '07. They are barely, it's taken them a year and a half to hire staff. It's taken them another 6 or 7 months to put together the proposals for what they'd want to look at. And as we sit here today, I don't think those studies have started. And so I take a look at this, the Delta package and all the infrastructure, and I say it's going to take us 2 or 3 years before things start operating. And we're going to need the resources to then be able to allocate the funds to the projects that we need to start moving to improve the Delta. And if we don't do that, then I think Assemblymember Arambula is absolutely correct. If we have a challenge with water, San Diego's at the end of the pipe. And so San Diego ought to be a little bit concerned. Next comes Orange County, and I know it's complicated how water gets transferred around, but the bottom line is that when we start hitting urban centers, people are going to be asking themselves, why didn't this legislature act? They knew it was coming. There are lots of reports out there for the past 20, 25 years saying we need to do this, and we're going to need the resources. So I look at the policy piece critically important along with the bond financing, and I'm mindful of the fisc of the state. I haven't sat through 3 years of excruciating budget discussions and not understand how critical it is that we are in a critically severe deficit, and that it's going to take us a while to pull ourselves out of it. But having said that, I do think that we have an opportunity, and I know it's been called rationing previously approved bonds. In my lexicon, it becomes prioritizing. It's what we do every day, and some things need to wait if it means that we have to fix our infrastructure to be able to make sure that we can continue our water deliveries, and that we have a way to be able to move water from one side of the valley to the other if that's what's necessary. But in regards to the bond discussion, I would like to ask if we have, and I know at one point we asked for a grid of the outstanding bonds that that are yet to. Let me rephrase that. A graph that has our bond indebtedness and how it will decline or increase over the next couple of years, and I'm assuming that it would increase if we released bonds in a certain category. But it's my understanding that we have a number of bonds that are ready to be paid off, which means that left to itself, our bond indebtedness would decline, not in relationship to what's coming in, because obviously that's going to be a big question mark. But if we could have that, I've seen one. I don't know who produced it.
There are various sources.
Several around.
Basically,
yes.
If the state stopped issuing bonds today, debt service would decline. However, the issue is that there are $54 billion of authorized but unissued general obligation bonds. And so the prioritization that you mentioned, and I agree that's the correct way to look at it, may result in water bonds being issued before some of these other bonds, and we can get you that information.
That would be very helpful. And I guess the question that I have is in terms of that prioritization, I would assume that there's a way to be able to set up our any bond language so that there is a trigger in terms of the percentage that is released from other bonds, so that we basically the legislature's in control of that, and we have the opportunity, apart from the discussion of continuous appropriation that we've been talking about. I'm excluding that. There's a way for us to be able to, because what we're talking about is, at least all the discussions I've heard recently have reflected a 2015 date for the release of at least half the bonds. And the reason for that is many of the infrastructure projects wouldn't be ready until that time anyway. But if there's a way to stage the bond issuance in a way that that helps us to set some priorities among other bonds, I think that would be the way to go. And I'm wondering if there's a way to be able to do that in terms of language.
The legislature has the power to do that, we believe, principally through the budget process each year, but also through legislation, through setting up, I guess you could say, a forward-looking framework that would think over the next decade or so about what bonds would be issued when. There are some exceptions to that. There are bonds that you have authorized that are tied to court orders in the prison system, for instance. And I think also one of the features of our state's finance system that investors and rating agencies and others are well aware of is that sometimes the initiative process produces bond authorizations that don't go through the legislature. As Mr. Rambula pointed out, that is a possibility as well. And to the extent that you have those types of initiatives, there can occasionally be, depending on the exact provisions, some difficulty in slowing those down. But we do think you do have an opportunity through the budget process or through other legislation to prioritize to a significant extent which bonds get issued when, and that may be an important tool over the next few years if you approve this package.
And last question, Senator Wolk.
Yes, it's more of a comment, and I really had finished, but I did, in response to the comments raised about the unemployment, I would like to make just a couple comments about that. I think it's important that we see the economy clearly with respect to the issue of unemployment. Because one of the questions, the driving forces here is whether or not the package plus the bond is going to relieve the unemployment issue. And I want to raise the question because we have to understand that while the unemployment is high, unacceptably high, in parts of the south part of the Central Valley, it is higher, and part of that is due to water, but not entirely. It's also due to the collapse of the construction industry. The fact is, in areas in the northern part of the Central Valley, the counties have higher unemployment. They have water. So it's important to see that clearly if we want the package to fix the problem that we're laying out. What concerns me is that we not pit one area, one farmer, one water agency against another. There are family farmers in the Delta as well. So improving a situation in one part of the state ought not be at the expense of another. And I think that's what the challenge is, but that's what I think we need to try and do. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank all three panelists. Very helpful information. And now, as stated at the beginning, my intent under public comment, it's about 3:20 here. We're going to start off with one representative from the 5 counties, and that would be Supervisor Don Natoli from Sacramento County. You, sir, have up to 5 minutes. All other people, after you state your name and affiliation of any organization, you'll have 2 minutes for your presentation after that, and that will end our hearing for today. I'm asking the sergeants, the other day, did we have, other than the first presenters, a microphone over here on the left? We don't have that here, so we're going to be walking back and forth. All right, that'll take longer. All right. Welcome, Supervisor Natoli.
You ready? Actually, I'm Mike McGowan from Yolo County. I'm a poor man's Don Natoli, I might add. But
I can blame it on my staff.
No, it's okay. Don't blame them. No. It's our pleasure to be here. Actually, I'm speaking on behalf of the 5 counties from the Delta, which includes Contra Costa County with Supervisor Mary Pifo, who could not be with us.
She spoke the other day.
Today, she spoke very well the other day. I hate to follow her act, but she would be here, but she's got other issues, as you can imagine. You mentioned Don Natoli from Sacramento. We're also honored to have Supervisor Mike Reagan from Solano County and Larry Rustaller from San Joaquin County here at my back. Briefly, I'll start out, actually, I think, with something I was going to close with, and that is, from day one, the requests of the Delta 5 counties, in our opinion, have been reasonable ones and designed to meet our concerns and our issues, and not designed to stop, block, or otherwise thwart good state policy on water and habitat restoration in the Delta. There are 3 truths that we think we would like you to speak to or listen to. One, the Delta counties are in the middle of the bullseye of the Delta for whatever it is you all decide to do. We will be dramatically impacted by the state policy, for good or for bad. We are the entities ultimately who will take one for the good of the team to fix the Delta for the rest of the state. And I think also very important, we believe, that the policies and projects dealing with fixing the Delta cannot be successful without the Delta counties' involvement, collaboration, and support. And the other fundamental truth is the one you've been talking about today, and that is simply this: you cannot do this at all, and it cannot be successful unless this project is adequately funded. That includes funding for the council. It includes funding for the Delta Protection Commission, includes funding for the Delta Conservancy, and it includes sufficient and adequate legally enforceable binding mitigation for the counties themselves who are impacted by this. The policy must be linked to adequate, reliable, and ongoing funding. Without this, the proposed policies cannot be implemented. The Delta cannot be restored or protected, and the state's water supply cannot be guaranteed. Without reliable funding to address mitigation of impacts to infrastructure and local economies, Delta communities will be devastated by the replumbing of the Delta to ensure exports. Without full mitigation of impacts, Delta counties will be forced to subsidize the statewide policy projects and potentially and inevitably reduce core services to our citizens. New policy must be linked to the passage of a new bond by the voters, and sufficient fees must be provided for beneficiaries or project proponents to mitigate economic impacts of the Delta counties. There must be a requirement that fees from beneficiaries and project proponents pay in perpetuity, forever and ever, amen, hallelujah, for in lieu taxes and local assessments and operations and maintenance of ecosystem lands and lands associated with conveyance. Delta counties must have legally binding right to full mitigation for all economic consequences of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and the Delta Plan. I do not envy you your task, especially on the finance part. My simple observation is that it's going to take a tremendously large GO bond to fund everything adequately, and maybe you can't afford that big of a bond. Therefore, you're faced with the dilemma of doing something, pardon my French, half-ass. This policy is so important, we ought not do it that way. All of these things to be funded, whether it's strictly GO, whether it's revenue, or whether it's fees, or a combination thereof. Don't do this statewide project unless you adequately fund both the things you're trying to accomplish and fully fund the mitigations, the impacts those counties that are directly impacted by that. The Delta 5 stands ready, as we always have, to make this a success. We are not trying to stand in the way or block this from occurring. We just want to make sure that our issues are heard, they're respected, they're responded to, so we can go about doing our business, and we can also go about making the statewide policy a success. With that, I want to thank you very much, especially our local homies, Senator Wolk and Assemblywoman Yamada, who have been steadfast in their courageous representation of our issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance, as always. Other people, 2 minutes each, starting with your name and affiliation. So you were last the other day, so you're second today.
Well, we're going in alphabetical order, but we're reversing it.
Last.
Yeah, Zuckerman, right.
Yeah.
It's hard to be farther down in the alphabet.
I don't want to use up your 2 minutes. Keep going.
I'm Tom Zuckerman, here representing the Central Delta Water Agency, a tireless observer and a 2-minute snippet responder again. The observation, the general 2-minute observation today is that we're taking a big fiscal package and we're paring it down to the point where we're not providing the financing for it. $9 billion bond is a lot of bond, but we were talking about a $50 billion package of things that are all included in the policy bill that you were looking at on Monday. So the question is, where is this all going to come from, particularly in a circumstance where we find ourselves in an economy today? And people come forward and are exhibiting their resistance to paying for portions of it, like mitigation of the projects and so forth. That's all going away from the beneficiaries, and it looks like it's getting left at the doorstep of the general taxpayer. And this is the same sort of phenomenon we're seeing with the water package, the policy part of it. The portions of it that are supposed to produce more supply or reduce demand are getting peeled off in this package as well. We're seeing the conservation burden being eliminated from or reduced from the large metropolitan areas, and I guess that's politics. But we end back up in a situation with an insufficient water supply to produce a solution and an insufficient financial package to pay for it. Particularly egregious in these bond bills is a declaration that the Delta is no longer part of the Sacramento River hydrologic basin. I mean, that certainly is a way to produce a lot of water. It's the one we fear the most, is that we're just going to reach in and grab the water that the Delta benefits from the Sacramento River. Thank you very much.
And we noted Senator Cogdill of that last concern.
Madam Chair, committee members, my name is Jim Metropolis. I represent Sierra Club, California. I'm here to state that we're opposed to both bonds that were introduced last night and were made available to us prior to this hearing. Sadly, we see nothing new here. There's nothing with user fees. There's no revenue bonds. We're not talking about leveraging money with the feds. Same old here. And the Sierra Club, you know, we've supported previous water bonds. We supported Prop 84. We supported Prop 50. We certainly have supported bonds in the past. We were hoping to see something different, and we're not getting that. Specifically, sure, you know, $3 billion in surface storage or dams continuously appropriated. Yeah, it's in a mix. It'll compete with others, but the continuous appropriation, hands off by the legislature, going to this new commission, not looking in favor of that. We've been talking about this policy, this Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Task Force that came up with the co-equal goals, this beautiful statement of water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration. And the first piece of the puzzle that you put to finance this provides for $2 billion for Delta restoration. Yes, there's some other restoration projects, let's say $3 billion. And the rest, $6 billion, probably going to water supply reliability. So right off the bat, it's no longer co-equal. We're giving lip service to the ecosystem restoration part of the co-equal goals. We're going straight for that water supply reliability. In closing, I would like to echo and support Senator Wolk's comment of saying that the BDCP needs to look at more alternatives. We would like to see what $1 in ditch digging would get us in other water supply options, and we are hopeful that that can be revisited in the policy package. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Evans. Good afternoon. My name is Steve Evans. I represent Friends of the River. Friends of the River is opposed to both the bond bills that were introduced last night for the simple fact that the state of California is nearly bankrupt and simply cannot afford to borrow more money. The debt service on the Cogdill bond would be more than $500 million a year for 30 years. $3 billion of that bond, actually both bonds, is continuously appropriated, which means the money to pay the debt for that portion would come off and away from schools in your district, health programs in your district, public safety programs in your district, and state parks in your district. We have to cut up the state's credit card and put it away and find other options. That means those who benefit directly by receiving water from water projects should pay for the cost of the water projects, as well as the mitigation, as well as the restoration costs. One of the big blank areas in all these bills is the assumption that somehow the taxpayer is responsible for restoring a delta that's been degraded by massive water exports. And in fact, the people who've received those water exports should be responsible for paying that cost. This bill is also a litigator's dream because it mixes finances with a lot of other very questionable policy initiatives, including legislating water rights, area of origin. It apparently tries to abrogate a federal court ruling on the state and federal cooperation in water projects. This thing is a nightmare. I would urge you not to approve it. Thank you.
Hello, Madam Chair, committee members, Barbara Berrigan-Perea. Today I'm here representing Restore the Delta and the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. I want to go back to the poll that Restore the Delta had commissioned in August. If you take a look at the results from that poll, when voters were given information about the peripheral canal and or large storage projects, depending on the county, but from statewide, 65 to 85% of voters would vote against such a bond that appropriated money for such projects. Voters clearly are much more interested in any type of bond financing going forward for water that will help with conservation and reclamation projects throughout California. I want to echo the comments made by Steve Evans with Friends of the River, and I also want to add that $3 billion for Delta restoration will not accomplish the goal of restoring fisheries. It won't bring back the fisheries. The fisheries cannot be restored until we have an evidentiary hearing through the State Water Resources Control Board to find out what the inflow standards need to be set at so that we will have enforceable standards for water quality and quantity in the Delta. Fish need water. We are in favor of strong regional planning. We want to see habitat conservation happen in the Delta, but without water, you can't bring back the fisheries. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Jonas Minton with the Planning Conservation League. Two technical issues and one broad comment. The first is there is some conflict in the wording between sections 79743 and 79731. This has to do with who is responsible for paying for mitigation and can bond funds be used. Those two sections appear to us to conflict. One place it says you can use bonds to fund mitigation, another place it says you can't. We obviously do not believe that that's a public benefit. It should be a responsibility of the project beneficiaries, and they should pay that. The second relates to the reappropriation of funds from Proposition 84 and 1E. And the question there is, especially if those funds are going to be used for administrative purposes for the new council, there are limits in those bonds on how much of that money can be used for administrative purposes. Yeah, so if a chunk is taken out, that could eliminate all the money needed to administer, for instance, the levee improvement projects that the voters approved as part of Proposition 1E. The biggest issue, however, is many of you have seen the poll numbers presented by some of the proponents. A water bond just doesn't have much chance of passing. This is based on two data sets I have, not the ones you've seen. One is my neighbors, who asked me what plan I'm living on when I discuss this with them. And secondly, even when I'm in meetings with water agency folks, I ask them, hey, are you going to vote for the bond? Ooh, no. We can't afford that as a state. So I just put that out there for you. And why is this important? It's important because the good things that do exist, there are some in the policy bills, the incentives for conservation are dependent. There aren't any requirements for conservation. Its incentives are found in the bond. If the bond doesn't pass, the conservation incentives go away. In addition, and perhaps more importantly from our perspective, that's where the money for the restoration comes from. And if that money goes away, the restoration doesn't happen, we don't meet the co-equal objectives, we're back to CalFed, we all get worse together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jones. Mr. Manning.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Ed Manning on behalf of Westlands Water District. First, we strongly support Senator Cogdill's bond and have supported that bond as a central part of a comprehensive policy package. And we see that as key to our support for SB 1, the policy bill that was heard the other day. Second, I think there's a lot of confusion about what is and isn't being paid for by whom and what revenue bonds are used for, et cetera. I'd just like to clarify that SB 1 makes crystal clear on page 98 that the contractors, state and federal contractors, are 100% solely responsible for the environmental analysis, mitigation, construction, maintenance, and operation of conveyance. Right. It is an enormous cost. Right now, just the environmental studies alone are in the range of $175 million. And the costs described by Mr. Keitlinger the other day of anywhere from, well, it was $50, now he says it's $75 to $125 an acre foot. is an enormous commitment by ratepayers throughout the state of California. So the notion that there is no skin in the game by the contractors, I think, is inaccurate, and those will be funded through revenue bonds by the contractors. Second, there are real economic impacts of not doing anything. Mr. Rambula mentioned the impacts on Fresno County, which I'm familiar with, which put an enormous burden on the state for resources there when food banks run out of money, when people don't have health care, et cetera, et cetera. But even looking at the context of SB 221, Senator Kuehl's bill, the population growth and demographics in California are not dependent on adequate schools or adequate water or adequate police. People come here. People will continue to come here. People will continue to have babies here. And the bottom line is we will need the water supply for those folks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello,
Mr.
Madam Chair,
Hanson?
members.
Hello.
Jay Hanson with the State Building Trades Council. As you well know, the state's water system was originally designed to provide water for people, agriculture, and industry. Now, today and in the future, the water system is also going to be required to pay for the environment. That's a statewide obligation. The Building Trades agrees that's a vital need for the use of the water. But with this new use comes a statewide obligation to help pay for the use. And a general obligation bond spreads the cost among all Californians is the correct and best way to help pay for the cost. Just as a little bit of historical perspective, in the 1960s, the state general fund used to spend about 20% of its money went for infrastructure. We're far, far below that today. Other needs and responsibilities have gobbled that up, and now we're looking at maybe going back towards that direction, but now it's going to be with debt from bond. It should have probably been paid up front, and it's been sorely neglected over many, many years. And to Mr. Huffman had an interesting point about bond rationing. I understand right now the Department of Finance and the Treasurer's Office already ration bonds every time there's a sale. They determine which bonds, which part of that $54 billion that's already been obligated is going to be able to be approved and be financed when they go up for sale. So bond rationing is already happening right now, but it's happening by the Department of Finance and the Treasurer. The proposal to stagger the use of bond funds, to smooth the debt payment makes good sense. Additionally, reprogramming past authorized bond debt is also wise as long as the authorizing language is also included in the bond. So if there's a change in what the money had originally been used for to go for a new use, as long as it's in the bond fund, it'd be fine. The Building Trade supports the proposed water policy that was discussed on Monday when it is tied to a financing package. Likewise, if there is policy proposed without the financing, we would be opposed. This needs to happen together. You can't have one without the other. We're very encouraged about the progress that you've made on doing this and updating our water system. It's sorely needed, and we'll stand with you to work through the process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kathy Cole with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. As you consider the financing option before you, Metropolitan would like to make two general points to put the need for public financing for water and Delta initiatives into a broader perspective. First, Metropolitan fully intends to pay with its own ratepayer funds, not from taxpayer funds, its share of the water conveyance improvements and related mitigation in the Delta. Those ratepayers are our businesses, our homes, and our farmers who pay through their water rates the cost for Metropolitan. The bond proposal by Senator Cogdill is clear on this point. For Metropolitan, the investments in upgrading the water system and restoring the Delta ecosystem represent a much smaller cost than replacing the state water project with alternative resources. Metropolitan's goal is to make the Delta investments that can regain the reliability of our own traditional supply, not additional water. Metropolitan and the other beneficiaries of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project are on a path to contribute more than $10 billion to water system and environmental mitigation in the Delta. The matching public funds in the proposed Cogdill bond for Delta ecosystem needs is tagged at $1.5 billion. BDCP estimates that those costs could be in the range of $2 to $3 billion. This represents a ratio of roughly $5 in water district funds for the Delta water system and ecosystem improvements compared to $1 in the necessary public funding. These public funds are absolutely necessary to meet the ecosystem recovery goals of the Delta policy legislation, and they are a modest investment compared to the funds that will come from water districts. Metropolitan believes very strongly it is essential to develop a strategy to identify the matching public funds as well as moving promptly on historic policy objectives of Delta governance, water use efficiency, and groundwater monitoring. Thank you for your time and dedication to helping get to the finish line.
Thank you, Kathy. Mr. Harris?
Madam Chair, excuse me. Thank you. Richard Harris on behalf of the Water Reuse Association. First off, we remain supportive of the funding levels that were in the September 11th versions, which was $500 million for water recycling. It's now down to $250 in both of what we saw. I want to give you a little historical perspective, though, because we come at that number not just because we come before you like everybody and say, please give us more money. 2002, Assemblymember Jackie Goldberg established the Recycled Water Task Force that was made up of a lot of stakeholders as well as all the public agencies. That task force reported back to the legislature in 2003 that, in fact, by 2030, we could recycle another 1.5 million acre feet of water a year, and it can be done quicker and easier, really, than any other water that's involved in this package that you're considering. But that number, that 1.5 million, had a large price tag of $11 billion worth of public investment. If you go into the cost-sharing formula of what you have before you, that'd be a 50% cost share. It'd be about $5.5 billion of state resources to match the local agencies and their ratepayers. So what we would submit is, it's already well documented that there's a great need. $500 million is, sorry to say it, a drop in the bucket, but it's a good first start. $250 really isn't. So I would ask you that as you move forward on that you consider that. We also would like to say that the State Water Board has done a really darn good job of the program administration of what they have, and nowhere, even we brought this up earlier in the summer, they still haven't been folded into the bill. They're not there. They're not the agency that's identified as spending, as administering the money. I think that from a technical point of view, that should be done. I'd also like to point out that on their existing list right now, they have $2 billion worth of projects that have been evaluated. CEQA's been done. They've prioritized it. The local agencies have done the applications. There's 87 projects in 50 jurisdictions in 15 counties around this state that if you funded them today, you'd get 400,000 acre feet a year immediately from those projects alone. So go to the State Water Board. Finally, we don't support any earmarking, especially the earmarking for the treatment that was in the Cogdell bill we saw this morning, that's set aside. No need for set asides. Let everybody
Any
compete.
other facts or information, please share with my staff or Mr. Huffman's. Appreciate
You want me to spill out some other ones? Or?
Not right now, but later on, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maureen O'Haron, representing the Irvine Ranch Water District. We definitely support financing as part of a comprehensive Delta package, but I want to associate my comments with Richard Harris's comments previously. We are strong proponents of water recycling, as you know, and we strongly believe that $500 million is, at least the need. I mean, the needs are much greater than that, but that should be at least the number in this package. And as Mr. Harris said, we strongly oppose this 40% set aside for advanced treatment projects that's in SB 2. We don't think these projects need the set aside. There are not every agency throughout the state can do this. We think it's very important that there be an even playing field and that all these projects can compete. If these projects are superior, they will already have a leg up in the competitive process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, Jim DeBoo on behalf of a bipartisan group of big city mayors, including Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, Mayor Ashley Swearingen of Fresno, Mayor Jerry Sanders of San Diego, Mayor Miguel Polito of Santa Ana, Mayor Bob Foster of Long Beach, and Mayor Chuck Reed of San Jose. They urge the inclusion of bond funds that would meet the needs of urban, agricultural, and Delta interests, and this includes a minimum investment in the following: $1 billion for groundwater protection and water quality, $1 billion for water recycling, $500 million for water conservation. In addition, they request ample funding be made available for drought relief, disadvantaged communities, and watersheds. Without these specific areas being addressed, this bipartisan group of mayors who represent roughly 7.7 million Californians will view this bond as incomplete. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members, thank you. Brent Walthall, the Kern County Water Agency. I'll try to be brief. We are supportive of Senator Cogdell's bond. We feel like the ability to fund the initiatives in the policy bill is very important, and the connection between the two is vital. Many of the people who have testified during public comment have agreed with that. We would associate ourselves with their comments. A policy bill that passes the legislature and ends up as part of the state's water code but that does not take advantage of the projects in a water bond will be a half measure. We need, and as I think this drought clearly illustrates, we need a greater ability to generate water supply, and since the policy bill does not do that, the water bond will have to pick up that slack, and we think that's an important consideration for the bill, for this committee. The other point I'd make is, although the Kern County Water Agency, not often thought of as the most environmental agency, we have spent a great deal of time going through the bond, as everyone has for the last 3 years. The most important component of this bond to us are the environmental monies for the Delta. That is the BDCP is contingent on those funds, and we think in order for the Delta to get better, we're going to have to see the kind of funding that is in the bonds. And if that's not available within the next couple of years, we will have a situation where the Delta is not fixed and continues in the same state it is today. Unacceptable to all of us. Thank you.
Dennis.
Good afternoon. Dennis Albiani with the Tehama-Coosa Canal Authority, as well as several agricultural associations, including the California Grain and Feed. We are supportive of the Cogdill bond as part of a comprehensive package, water package that we believe should be appropriately linked to the policy package that's also being considered, and that includes linkage at the ballot box as well. The positive attributes of the Cogdill bond is that this is a statewide balanced measure that has both infrastructure as well as environmental improvements. It has short-term funding for integrated regional water management plans, as well as longer-term water supply issues such as obviously water storage and environmental benefits. So it balances those elements. It also, and there's been a little bit of discussion about this, leverages significant funding. For example, a project that's important to the Tehama-Coosa Canal Authority has a 4-to-1 federal match. It's $60 million that's in this, that could be available in this bond, would leverage at least $165 million worth of federal funding, of which $110 million has already been authorized and appropriated. So it's there, it's now, and it's available for not only infrastructure but also stimulus. On behalf of, unfortunately, one of my cohorts at the California Farm Bureau had to leave for a board meeting, so he wanted me to make some comments on his behalf, so I'll take that. The Farm Bureau has been working with Senator Cogdill for the entire 3 years of the life of his bond. While they do not have a direct position on this bond until probably later today at their board meeting, he did want to say that they're very supportive of the process that Cogdill's been doing, very supportive of the past bonds, and are likely to get to that position, and look forward to working on this and believe it's the right way to go to a comprehensive water package and the only way we get to a comprehensive water package. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan Clay on behalf of the San Diego County Water Authority. We have no official position yet on this bond. We have been strong advocates for a comprehensive package, but we wanted to provide our kind of quick overview of some of the aspects of this from a San Diego perspective. First, in terms of the Chapter 8, the surface storage category, we think that there's different criteria in there that would prevent a good local surface storage project such as San Vicente from being able to qualify for this. Specifically in Section 79741, there's conditions that apply to surface storage but do not apply to groundwater storage. We think the language should mirror each other, either one way or the other. In Section 79742, there's language in there that ties it to measurable improvements in the Delta. Projects such as San Vicente, which help regions as ours go through dry periods and reduce our reliance on the Delta. I think some accommodation of that language needs to be incorporated as well, and we've been saying that throughout the process. Finally, the provisions in the bill in terms of the timing of when money gets released, our project will probably be built water behind the dam before those dates come into effect, and we think some of those dates should be bumped up. In terms of Chapter 6, the water supply reliability, in the IRWM section, there's 2 pots of money in there, $400 million apiece. There's a number of projects that qualify under that, but there's nowhere in there is there specifically a call out for local surface storage projects. We think that should be corrected. Again, when you don't have lots of groundwater and you have a CEQA approved surface storage project that makes sense for that region, we think it should be able to compete for those pots of funding. Chapter 9, the watershed protection. Yes, there's $1.5 billion in there for local streams and others. Unfortunately, much of that money has been carved up. Yes, there's a $20 million appropriation or call out for the San Diego River, but there's other rivers within San Diego, and there's not a lot of money left at the end. Finally, just in closing, the Chapter 11, the 40% carve out, we are strongly opposed for that 40% carve-out for the advanced treatment recycling provisions.
Yep, got it.
Jennifer Clary from Clean Water Action. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. We have deep concerns about this bond. And just to illustrate it, I've been working for many years to try to increase access to funding for small communities without safe drinking water. And when I come to legislators, or I go to a regulator, or I go to stakeholders, they say, well, tell me the problem. What's the number? Tell me what you need, or prove what you need. So I can tell you now that the need for small community drinking water infrastructure is $3.4 billion over the next 20 years. I can tell you that the State Water Board has a $1 billion waiting list for community wastewater projects. I can't tell you what the wait list is for the other items on this bond, and I guess I would ask that with such limited bond money that we be more careful about how we allocate funds. I would say that some of the biggest issues I see is that we continue not to fund agencies to do their job, that the State Water Board and other agencies have been scraping for funds, and bonds have been used to backfill positions, and that's a very expensive way to pay for operating. And so I would urge that if you're going to move ahead with a bond, that it be part of an integrated finance system. You can't have bonds alone. CalFed tried to do that, and it didn't work. You need to fund agencies. You need to fund operations monitoring, not from bonds. Thank you. Good point.
Good afternoon. Chris Uncle, Ducks Unlimited. Once again, I'd like to commend Senator Cogdill for addressing the refuge water supply funding issue in his legislation. As did all of the previous versions, the funding level was at $100 million, which represented only a portion of what actually was needed to purchase permanent water supplies for the public refuge system in California. His bond actually reduced the number down to $20 million, which is below what we would consider to be adequate. And so we would hope that whenever the dust settles and a final number is achieved, that the $100 million level will be attained, and we can adequately fund our refuge water supply system. The supply of water through the purchase of permanent water rights is a far more efficient way of doing it, and probably will save the state money in the long run rather than buying it on a spot market basis, which is catch as catch can and usually more expensive than buying a long-term water right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Mark Henley with the California Outdoor Heritage Alliance, also representing California Waterfowl Association. I'd like to echo Ducks Unlimited's comments. We certainly appreciate the inclusion of funding for CVPIA wetland water needs in the bond. We would like to see that $20 million that's in Senator Cogdill's bond be raised to $100 million due to a total need of about $400 million for wetland water needs via the CVPIA, and the state is actually obligated to provide a 25% cost share of that. So the $100 million would really help to meet that state cost share amount. We'd also urge that the funding that's provided for the California Waterfowl Habitat Program be maintained at $10 million due to escalating costs of acquiring wetland water, and just management costs in general have been going up. So $10 million would really do the trick with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Jennifer West here representing Inland Empire Utilities today. And we want to thank the committee for their work on these bonds. I would like to associate my comments with Richard Harris from Water Reuse. We wanted to speak today about the recycled water and the level of funding for the recycled water in the bonds. As he pointed out, the September 11th version of the bond did include $500 million for recycling. We'd like to see, at a minimum, that level be restored. We think that recycled water is incredibly important to our future water supply. And once again, point out that the Cogdill bill unfortunately has a 40% carve-out for one type of treatment that appeared in the bond this morning for the first time. It wasn't in any of the previous versions. And we would like to see that part deleted and go back to no carve-outs and just straight funding for the source. So thank you very much.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, members, Dave Puglia with Western Growers. We, too, have been working with Senator Cogdill for 3 years now on this bond measure, and what you have before you is substantially the same as Senator Cogdill's first attempt at this, understanding there are changes that need to be discussed further, but from a structural standpoint, we're looking at pretty much the same comprehensive approach to the problem. I would also associate myself, to limit time here, with Mr. Manning and Mr. Walthall. Their comments echo our concerns. And just note that as you look at this as a comprehensive problem and the bond as a comprehensive solution, we view Chapter 6, the Integrated Regional Water Management money, as critical, because if you glance back at the last 20 or 30 years, that's really where our water supply has come from in California, is those local monies that water districts have used to stretch supplies through greater conservation, greater efficiency delivery measures. That is probably our best bridge solution, along with water transfers for folks in the farming industry, while some of this infrastructure is developed and comes online. Chapter 7, the Delta chapter, is critical for reasons that were already stated, and that goes to a longer-term solution, which includes improved conveyance, and of course Chapter 8 provides additional supply. So we do view this as a comprehensive package. We do believe it is well structured and should be partnered with a policy package that hopefully comes together into a form we would be able to support in the very near future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair. Glenn Farrell with the Front Water Authority. We're in support of Senator Cogdill's water bond. We've long been supportive of a very comprehensive package that includes substantive and meaningful general obligation bond component as presented by Senator Cogdill this afternoon. In order to avoid repetition, I just want to also concur with comments of my colleagues from Westlands Water District, Kern County Water Agency, and Western Growers. Associate myself with their comments, and just wanted to make sure that, I wanted to say that we're very optimistic that a deal can be done. It's really close at this point. We're very optimistic that a policy package is coming together. There are a few remaining issues left, but we're optimistic that those can be addressed. But the water bond component is a key and critical linkage piece as part of that package. And so as this moves forward in the coming days, we're supportive of that very strong linkage of that comprehensive policy package with the bond.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, members of the respective committees, I'm Ron Davis with the Association of California Water Agencies, and I could be short by incorporating by reference all the water agencies' comments, but I do want to say a few things. While we have not taken this to our board of directors yet, Senator Cogdill's measure is very consistent with bills that we have supported in the past, and it is a comprehensive approach to addressing Delta sustainability, new water supply, and I agree with the comments made by Dave just a moment ago that it's very important to have the local water resource development Chapter 6 appropriately funded as well. Those are the funds that have allowed us to meet the needs as we've worked through the long-term approaches that we've been working on for decades now. We also believe it's very important to have a funding package tied to the policy bills that you're discussing right now. So we would incorporate by reference those comments that strongly support a funding component to the very important policy package that you're working on currently. And we look forward to continuing to work with the Senator as well as members of this committee in developing both the bond and the comprehensive package. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sylvia Solis-Shaw on behalf of Contra Costa Water District. The district believes that SBX 7.2 and SBX 7.3 remove the area of origin protections for Delta water users. The language also removes protections currently afforded the Delta and its ecosystem and would remove the water right protections affirmed in SBX 7.1. The district opposes those bills for that reason and will be forced to change its position on SBX 7X1 from support to oppose if that language remains. In addition, the district urges the legislature to develop the financing plan that includes the beneficiary pays principle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Members of the committee, Kathy Mannion with the Regional Council of Rural Counties. I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. We do not have a position on the bond at this point in time. We've reviewed it, and we'll be providing you with written comments as the days go by in the very near future. I did want to mention to you today, since we have been very vocal on the issue of area of origin and water right priority language that has appeared in different vehicles, including in Senator Cogdell's bond, that we are very interested in working with the other parties to whom this is very important to try to resolve the issues that we have raised. So we've committed to working on that, and hopefully we can resolve those issues so that we then could move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, members, John O'Malley with Lang, Hanson, O'Malley, and Miller, representing Central Basin Municipal Water District. In the interest of brevity, I'd like to confine my comments to that section of the bill that carves out 40% for advanced technology water recycling. As everyone in the room knows, every gallon of recycled water produced by whatever process reduces the demand for an equal amount of potable water. To limit the amount of funding available for traditional recycling projects and carving out a 40% earmark is very short-sighted in our opinion. Central Basin strongly feels that funding for recycled water should be increased back to the minimum of the $500 million level that was included in the previous water bonds, and should be awarded on a competitive basis regardless of the process used. For those reasons, we strongly oppose that 40% carve-out and urge you to try and do something to alleviate that situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go with the man who's been waiting patiently at the podium because he sort of jumped in there and didn't keep that similar lineup strategy.
Thank you.
So I waited till we finished at the end of the table.
Madam Chair, Don Zay with Northern California Water Association. We too have worked closely with Senator Cogdell over the last couple of years on his efforts on water policy in general and the bond. While we'll reserve our support specifically for it at this point, I can tell you that we're very supportive of what we see so far, especially in the Chapter 8 funding. As you know, the Sac Valley hydrologic region provides a considerable amount of support to the state's ecological and water supply needs, most certainly within the Sac Valley, but also the Delta. We believe that the environmental and other public benefits provided through this bond's Chapter 8 funding will make a significant contribution to meeting the ecological objectives of the water package, certainly through the building of sites, reservoirs, I know you've all heard a lot about. But the package issue is really my point two and final point. NAWQA's support, which has been consistent from the beginning, is predicated on a comprehensive package, including this bond. While we've made a lot of contributions along with the agricultural sector and the ag water sector in terms of getting closer on policy, we cannot support the package in its entirety unless this bond moves forward with the policies, because it will take additional water, no doubt, from the Sac Valley to provide the benefits that the policies are trying to achieve. So we encourage you to continue to march forward, and we look forward to constructive participation and hopefully maximizing the benefits of the Chapter 8 funding. Thank you.
All right, starting here.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Paul Bauer on behalf of the Groundwater Resources Association and the California Groundwater Coalition. I'd just like to emphasize and join others in saying that we'd like to see the groundwater funding increase in the package moving forward. We believe that groundwater funding is critical to reducing dependence on the Delta, and these projects are ready to go now. They will help meet the interim needs of the Southern California region in particular, but other parts of the state that also currently rely on Delta water. We think there's been a historical lack of funding for these projects by the state that we could see remedied in this package, and we think the time is now. We look forward to working with each and every one of you as we move forward on this effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nicole Seward, and I am a Delta landowner, Delta business owner, and a fourth-generation California boater. I just wanted to make the comment, and I recognize that all of you are being asked to do a legacy vote. It's not just this bond, it's the whole new Delta plan. It is a legacy vote for all of your careers. A legacy can be one of destruction, or it can be something positive. This one is, the whole Delta plan is a plan of destruction of Delta lands, Delta farms, Delta businesses, Delta families, Delta futures. And it is wrong to do at this time. The plan, as our supervisors, the 5 county supervisors, expressed to you, it does not represent the Delta, and we're the ones being asked to sacrifice. Another gentleman said co-equal goals require co-equal funding, and it should be at the same time. If you're going to go forward with this, this does need co-equal funding, but it needs to be funded by the people who are going to be the end users, not the Delta people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair and members, Jerry Desmond Jr., representing Recreational Boaters of California. It's a statewide organization of 70,000 boating families. It's in its 43rd year of existence on an issue that I don't think has been brought up before the committee yet, and it's the concerns of the boating community with a specific project, a fish restoration project down in Old River Slough and Connection Slough in the southern part of the Delta. It's called the Two Gates Project. That right now there are 3 hearings going on, one in Stockton, Discovery Bay, and Fresno, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Many boaters there are expressing concerns with the negative impact that well-minded, well-intended project would have on navigation, blocking off the Discovery Bay community and commerce, and raising significant safety issues with a 75-foot wide butterfly opening that will create different flows and different heights. And so we have found, as we're gauged into that process, that both in SB X17, specifically Section 74 of the bill on page 112, provides $28 million in funding appropriation for the gates. Also in the 2 bills before us today for consideration, SB X72 and SB X73, there are provisions providing for funding for restoration, enhancement, and recreational purposes. We will be presenting to the committee, placing into writing our request for provisions that would provide that as that project moves forward, there's an accommodation through boating locks to provide the boating opportunities through that. We think it's vitally important because as we look at the bonding features, that's for the future, beyond the 5-year temporary experiment of the current project and into what we talk about our legacy. So we'll be preparing specific provisions that present them to the committee following today's hearing.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, my name is Barbara Daly, and I'm a volunteer. I live in the Delta, and I've been trying to follow this fairly closely for about the last 6 months. I've heard a lot of good things in testimony and public comment through the many hearings that have been going on, and I am not a water expert. I know you have a very tough decision. I think in this bill there probably are some very good things, such as recycling and water conservation, and very, very good things. But I would like to ask that you not allow a peripheral canal and all of its large diversion facilities to shape and remodify the Delta region. If you're going to take, and I put that word in parentheses, if you are going to take the Delta and everything that goes with it, I ask that you please leave it intact. Please respect it as the heart of California that it really is. Many people don't know about the Delta. It's a well-kept secret, quite honestly, but it is really the heart of our state. And to reshape it and to modify it in the name of restoration is something that I ask you not to do, please. I ask you to allow us to all live together in this state peacefully and not to trade Northern California to Southern California in the name of development or in the name of big agriculture. We have agriculture here too. We provide a lot of good food, and we do provide water. It comes past our homes, at least where I live. One of the things I'm afraid of is that as Californians, we're not going to be able to afford the water. We'll be able to afford the development, we'll have houses, and we'll have food from the Central Valley, but we won't be able to afford our water bills. And we may not even be able to afford that food. I've talked with someone in LA, and their water bills right now are over $350 a month for a modest house. That's a lot of money, and the average farmer, the farmhand, can't pay that. I think there are other ways.
You could end that. Thank you.
So I just hope it doesn't get too expensive to live here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back up at the front end of the table. You.
Oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
please.
I thought someone was behind me here.
No.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing us to speak. My name is Kim Glassard, here on behalf of Organic Sacramento and Save the Delta. We're strongly opposed to the bond bill process. It's currently happening right now. It's very disturbing that in such economically challenging times that the public is being asked to pay for special interest needs of water exporters and Southern California developers, while the real needs of the Delta and the need to protect and rehabilitate vital ecosystems for fish and other aquatic species, many of them that are being threatened with extinction right now, are not being adequately addressed. And this process, it's very interesting to me that the process, no matter how much talk is happening here, nowhere are you dealing with the real issues, the immediate issues of the Delta's crisis. And I'm thinking, well, what is the real agenda here if you're not really dealing with the needs that are currently there and are of concern? Again, I don't believe that this process has been complete enough to make any real crucial to make the crucial decisions that need to be made for California's water, for our future, for the most important resource of California. Especially the information being provided in these this week's special session hearings. It's just not adequate. The process, the time hasn't been adequate, and I think that it's really important that this be continued to the next year, the next session, and that we not try to rush something that is going to be, as people have mentioned, it's the future, it's the legacy, it's everything that California is and will be forever, basically, is what you're making this decision on. So thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bob Reeb, speaking on behalf of the Water Replenishment District of Southern California, to speak in favor of the 40% allocation under the water recycling chapter for advanced water treatment. Had to run across the street. Had to run across the street. Let me explain. As a chair well knows.
So why should it be carved out? Go ahead.
I'd be happy to answer questions, because it may take more than 2 minutes. As the chair well knows, over 1 billion gallons of treated wastewater leaves Southern California to the Pacific Ocean daily. These advanced water treatment projects are recycled projects, but they are imperative for areas that have high use, high vulnerable groundwater basins in Los Angeles, generally in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Orange counties. In these areas, recycled water is being used for injection and groundwater recharge purposes. These projects, however, traditional recycling does not treat the water to the degree that will satisfy Department of Public Health and regional board regulations, because the assimilative capacity of the groundwater in those basins is such that regularly treated recycled water can't be used. So we need to move towards this advanced water treatment in order to recharge those. Secondly, in doing so, my client, one project that they're sharing with Upper San Gabriel Valley Water District will relieve that area of approximately 21,000 acre-feet of water that they now bring down from the Delta for replenishment purposes. So it serves another purpose of bringing regional independence and removing groundwater recharge in those areas from a call upon the Delta. Finally, state funding will enable us to leverage federal dollars. We've been back to Washington. WRD is part of the New Blue Water Coalition. We've been back to Washington, D.C. Orange County Water District, a member, received $67 million for their $480 million project. They got $20 million federal dollars because of that Prop 13 California investment. So it's critically important.
going to have to end it there, and then some other time, come explain to my staff exactly why it needs to be a carve-out. Next person.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Mike Dillon, representing the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, the major wastewater agencies in the state. I just wanted to add our voices to the others who have spoken before you earlier about increasing the amount of funding for recycled water. We view that as low-hanging fruit, and we think it's quite significant and ought to be encouraged. With respect to set-aside, we have some questions on that as well. Thank you.
You might want to talk to Mr. Reed.
Go, yeah.
My name is Dan Bacher. I'm editor of Fish Sniffer magazine and also
which magazine? Sorry.
Fish Sniffer magazine, and write for a number of other magazines, and also I'm an advisor to Restore the Delta. I strongly oppose the water bond for a number of reasons, but these are three of the most important ones. Number one is, Assemblyman Huffman pointed out, this bill takes the delta out of the area of origin, and it says, quote, the Sacramento River hydrological area doesn't include any area within the delta. I mean, this is an amazing statement to be included in a piece of legislation. I mean, where is it? Is it on Mars? Is it on the East Coast in Chesapeake Bay? But just on that, I would oppose the bill. Second, the cost is enormous. We don't need another bond other water bond or any bond when California is in its greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. We don't have the money. We can't afford this legislation. Thirdly, this bond needs to be looked at in the context of the whole water package, what creates the pathway or a roadmap to the peripheral canal, which I strongly oppose. And I want to end with a couple questions that I've asked the legislature and asked people that support the canal before that they've never successfully answered. The first, is there any case in world or U.S. history where diversion canal has led to less diversion out of a river system rather than more? Secondly, is there any case in history of the U.S. or the world where a diversion canal has led to a restored ecosystem rather than a greatly degraded ecosystem? Nobody's been able to answer those two questions yet.
Your 2 minutes is up, but I thank you very much for your testimony. Okay. And last.
Hi, Dennis Cushman with the San Diego County Water Authority. I just wanted to clarify. Heard a remark from an earlier speaker that was speaking in favor of the carve-out in the water recycling section. I want to make perfectly clear the San Diego County Water Authority does not support and, in fact, opposes the carve-out in the water recycling section, believes all of the funding in the water recycling section should be open, competitive, and cost-share statewide. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. All right. Thank you to members who stayed till the very end. I greatly appreciate that. We've been taking notes on some of the comments made by the people who stayed and provided public testimony. As of right now, another hearing is not scheduled, but Assemblymember Huffman and I will be looking at that as the week unfolds, whether there should be another informational hearing. And with that, I bid you all a good afternoon and good evening.